The morning sun filtered through the grimy windows of number 4 Privet Drive, casting long shadows across the pristine kitchen, where Harry Potter knelt on the cold linoleum floor, scrubbing at a stain that had been there longer than he could remember. His knees ached from the awkward position, and his thin arms trembled from the repetitive motion, but he dared not stop. Not when Uncle Vernon was pacing behind him like a caged bull, his heavy footsteps punctuating each laboured breath. Vernon Dursley was in one of his moods, the kind that made the air in the house feel thick and dangerous, where every sound Harry made seemed to echo too loudly, where even breathing felt like an act of defiance. It had started 3 days ago, when Mrs. Figg from down the street had made an innocent comment about Harry looking thin. Vernon had smiled his plastic smile and assured her that Harry was perfectly healthy, just naturally slight like his father had been. But the moment they were inside, that smile had vanished like smoke. Harry had learned to read the signs over the years, the way Vernon's neck turned purple above his collar, the particular set of his shoulders that meant punishment was coming. The dangerous quiet in his voice when he spoke. This morning, all the signs were there, amplified by something Harry could not quite identify. There was an urgency to Vernon's anger today, a desperation that made it somehow worse than usual. The scrub brush slipped from Harry's wet fingers, clattering against the floor. The sound might as well have been a gunshot for the way Vernon's pacing stopped abruptly. "Your mother was a freak," Vernon said suddenly, his voice carrying that peculiar mixture of disgust and satisfaction that always accompanied his worst pronouncements. "But at least she had the decency to get herself killed before she could corrupt you completely." Harry's hand stilled on the brush. He had heard variations of this speech countless times over the years. But something about today felt different. There was a rehearsed quality to Vernon's words, as though he were practicing lines for an audience that was not yet present. "We have been more than generous," Vernon continued, his voice rising with each word. "More than generous in taking you in when no one else would have you, clothing you, feeding you, putting a roof over your ungrateful head. And what do we get in return? Nothing but trouble and strange happenings, and neighbours asking questions they have no business asking." Harry kept his eyes fixed on the floor, watching droplets of soapy water drip from the brush. He had learned long ago that responding only made things worse. Vernon was not looking for conversation or explanation. He was looking for an excuse, and Harry was determined not to give him one. But Vernon seemed determined to escalate matters regardless. He grabbed Harry by the shoulder, his thick fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises, and hauled him to his feet. Harry bit back a gasp of pain, knowing that any sound would only fuel Vernon's anger further. "Look at me when I am speaking to you," Vernon hissed, his face inches from Harry's. "You will show proper respect in this house, boy. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," Harry whispered, the words bitter in his mouth. Vernon studied Harry's face for a long moment, as though searching for signs of defiance or hidden rebellion. Finding none, he released his grip with a shove that sent Harry stumbling backward against the kitchen counter. "You will finish every inch of this floor," Vernon said, gesturing broadly at the kitchen. "Then you will clean my study from top to bottom, every surface, every corner, every piece of furniture, and you will not stop until I say it is perfect. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Harry repeated, though his heart sank at the magnitude of the task. Vernon's study was his private domain, a cluttered shrine to his own importance, filled with files from his drill company, awards for various business achievements, and an impressive collection of expensive whiskey that he claimed was for entertaining clients, but which Harry knew he consumed primarily when Aunt Petunia was at her book club meetings. "Good," Vernon said, his mood shifting abruptly to something resembling satisfaction. "And when you are finished, you will go to your room and stay there until further notice. No supper tonight. Perhaps hunger will teach you to appreciate what you have here." Harry nodded silently, already calculating how long the cleaning would take, and how much of his meager energy reserves it would consume. He had grown skilled at such calculations over the years, learning to pace himself so that he could complete whatever impossible tasks were set before him without collapsing entirely. Vernon left the kitchen without another word, his heavy footsteps echoing up the stairs toward his bedroom. Harry heard the door slam with enough force to rattle the pictures hanging in the hallway, and then the house settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the distant sound of Aunt Petunia's morning television programs. Harry returned to his scrubbing with mechanical precision, working his way across every inch of the kitchen floor until it gleamed under the fluorescent lights. His back ached, and his hands were raw from the harsh cleaning solution, but he pressed on, driven by the knowledge that any imperfection would result in having to start over from the beginning. When he was finally satisfied that the floor met Vernon's exacting standards, he gathered his supplies and made his way toward the study. The study door stood slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of the chaos within. Vernon's desk was buried under stacks of papers and folders, while the bookshelves that lined the walls were crowded with binders, awards, and various knickknacks that he had collected over the years. The room smelled of old leather and stale whiskey, with undertones of the cheap cologne that Vernon wore to mask his tendency to perspire heavily during the warmer months. Harry pushed the door open fully and surveyed the task ahead of him. Every surface would need to be dusted, every piece of furniture moved and cleaned underneath, every book and paper carefully handled and returned to its exact original position. Vernon had a photographic memory for the arrangement of his possessions, and he would notice immediately if anything was out of place. Starting with the bookshelves, Harry worked methodically from left to right, removing each item, dusting both the object and the shelf beneath it, then replacing everything exactly as he had found it. The work was tedious and time-consuming, but it allowed his mind to wander, which was both a blessing and a curse. When his thoughts were occupied with the mechanical aspects of cleaning, he could almost forget the pain in his knees and the empty ache in his stomach. But when his mind had nothing to focus on, it inevitably drifted toward darker territory. He thought about Mrs. Figg's innocent comment, and wondered what it would be like to have someone notice his condition out of genuine concern rather than idle curiosity. He thought about the other children at school, who complained endlessly about their parents' rules and expectations, never realizing how fortunate they were to have parents who set limits out of love rather than malice. He thought about his own parents, trying to imagine what they might have been like, how different his life might have been if they had lived. But such thoughts were dangerous, he had learned. They led to questions he was not allowed to ask, to longings that could never be fulfilled, to a bitterness that would only make his situation worse. Better to focus on the task at hand, to lose himself in the rhythm of work, to count each completed section as a small victory that brought him closer to the solitude of his room. By mid-afternoon, Harry had worked his way around 3/4 of the study. His back screamed in protest every time he bent to clean under furniture, and his empty stomach had progressed from a dull ache to sharp pangs that made it difficult to concentrate. But he pressed on, driven by the knowledge that failure was not an option. It was while maneuvering Vernon's heavy desk chair to clean beneath it that disaster struck. The chair was heavier than Harry had anticipated, and his weakened state made it difficult to control. As he tried to pivot the chair around the desk, one of its legs caught on something beneath the floorboards. There was a sharp crack, and suddenly a section of the floor gave way slightly, revealing what appeared to be a loose board. Harry froze, staring at the damaged floorboard with growing panic. Vernon would be furious about any damage to his precious study, no matter how accidental. The punishment for such a transgression would be severe, possibly involving days without food or weeks confined to his room. But as Harry knelt to examine the damage more closely, he realized that the board had not been broken by his actions. Rather, it appeared to have been deliberately loosened, as though someone had created a hiding place beneath the floor. Curiosity warred with caution as Harry stared at the loose board. Every instinct screamed at him to leave it alone, to find some way to disguise the damage and hope that Vernon would not notice. But there was something compelling about the discovery, something that whispered of secrets and hidden truths that might finally provide answers to questions he had carried his entire life. With trembling fingers, Harry worked the loose board free from its position. Beneath it was a small cavity, perhaps 8 inches square and 4 inches deep, lined with what appeared to be waterproof material. And nestled within that cavity was a single document, rolled and tied with a red ribbon that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly quality. Harry's breath caught in his throat. Even without understanding exactly what he was looking at, he recognized that this was something significant. The ribbon alone suggested importance beyond anything he had ever encountered, and the careful way the document had been hidden spoke of secrets that someone very much wanted to keep. His hands shook as he reached for the document, half expecting it to vanish like a mirage the moment he touched it. But it was solid and real beneath his fingers, the parchment thick and expensive feeling in a way that suggested official importance. The ribbon came away easily, as though it had been designed to be removed, and Harry unrolled the document with the careful reverence of someone handling a priceless artifact. What he saw made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The document bore official seals from both the British Ministry of Magic and what appeared to be a legal firm specializing in wizarding law. At the top, in ornate lettering, were the words Custody and Compliance Agreement. Below that, in smaller but equally formal text, was a date from 11 years ago, just months after Harry had been placed with the Dursleys. But it was the signatures at the bottom that made Harry's world tilt sideways. There, in familiar handwriting, were the names Vernon Dursley, Petunia Dursley, and Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. With growing horror, Harry began to read the terms of the agreement. The language was formal and legal, filled with euphemisms and careful phrasing, but the meaning was unmistakably clear. The Dursleys had agreed to maintain custody of Harry Potter until his majority, ensuring his compliance and proper development through necessary disciplinary measures and environmental controls. In exchange, they would receive monthly compensation from a fund administered by the Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, with additional bonuses for exceptional circumstances requiring enhanced behavioral modification. Harry's vision blurred as the words sank in. The document went on to specify that any reports of unusual incidents or concerning behaviors should be documented and submitted quarterly, with assurances that appropriate memory modification protocols would be employed to maintain secrecy. There were clauses about maintaining Harry's isolation from the magical community, about ensuring his compliance through traditional disciplinary methods, about the importance of preventing him from developing unrealistic expectations regarding his status or treatment. But perhaps most devastating of all was a section near the end that outlined the consequences of non-compliance. Should the Dursleys fail to maintain the agreed-upon conditions, or should Harry prove unmanageable through conventional means, the agreement provided for alternative placement options, including specialized residential facilities designed for the containment and conditioning of difficult magical children. Harry read the document 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of horror and betrayal. This was not a simple custody arrangement, or even a misguided attempt at protection. This was a carefully orchestrated system of abuse, designed and funded by the very people who were supposed to be protecting him. Every beating, every missed meal, every cruel word and deliberate humiliation had been not just permitted, but actively encouraged by those who held ultimate authority over his fate. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs snapped Harry back to the present with terrifying clarity. Vernon was coming downstairs, probably to check on his progress, or to find some new fault that would justify additional punishment. In seconds, he would discover Harry with the document, and the consequences would be beyond imagining. Moving with desperate speed, Harry rolled the document back up and retied the ribbon, his fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar material. He placed it back in its hiding place and worked the loose floorboard back into position, praying that his hasty repairs would hold long enough to avoid immediate detection. Then he grabbed his cleaning supplies and positioned himself at Vernon's desk, scrubbing industriously at an invisible stain, just as the study door opened fully. Vernon filled the doorway like a malevolent mountain, his small eyes scanning the room with suspicious intensity. "You are making progress," he observed, though his tone suggested disappointment at finding no obvious faults. "Make sure you do not neglect the corners behind the furniture. I will be checking everything when you claim to be finished." "Yes, sir," Harry managed, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. He focused on his scrubbing, afraid that his face would betray the seismic shift that had just occurred in his understanding of the world. Vernon lingered in the doorway for several more seconds, as though sensing that something had changed, but unable to identify exactly what. Finally, he withdrew with a grunt of dissatisfaction, leaving Harry alone with his racing thoughts and the terrible weight of newfound knowledge. As the afternoon wore on, Harry continued his cleaning with mechanical precision, but his mind was entirely occupied with the implications of what he had discovered. Every interaction with the Dursleys over the years took on new meaning in light of the contract. Every instance of cruelty or neglect revealed itself as part of a larger plan, a deliberate strategy designed to break his spirit and ensure his compliance. But perhaps most devastating of all was the realization that Dumbledore, the wizard who was revered throughout the magical world as the greatest champion of light and justice, had been the architect of his suffering. The man who was supposed to be protecting him had instead engineered a system that guaranteed his misery, all while maintaining plausible deniability through carefully worded legal documents and euphemistic language. The cleaning supplies felt impossibly heavy in Harry's hands as he worked to complete the final sections of the study. His body moved through the familiar motions of dusting and scrubbing, but his mind was reeling with questions and possibilities. What did this mean for his future? Who else knew about the agreement? Were there other children trapped in similar situations? And most importantly, what could he possibly do with this information? He was 9 years old, trapped in a house with people who had been paid to abuse him, isolated from anyone who might help him, with no resources and no allies. The contract had shown him the truth of his situation, but it had also revealed just how powerless he truly was. The very people who were supposed to protect magical children were the ones who had engineered his torment. But as Harry finished cleaning the last corner of the study and prepared to return the room to its original configuration, a new thought began to take shape in his mind. The contract was evidence, proof of crimes that would shock even the magical world, and if he could somehow find a way to expose the truth, to bring the document to the attention of people who cared more about justice than politics, then perhaps this discovery could become the key to not just his own freedom, but to preventing other children from suffering the same fate. The sound of the front door opening interrupted his thoughts, followed by Aunt Petunia's sharp voice calling out her arrival. Harry quickly finished positioning the furniture and gathered his cleaning supplies, his mind already working on the problem of how to safely secure the document and find someone trustworthy enough to help him expose the truth. As he climbed the stairs toward his small room, Harry felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. It was fragile and dangerous, this feeling that perhaps his suffering might finally serve a purpose. But it was real, and it was his, and for the first time in his life, Harry Potter began to believe that he might have the power to change his own destiny. The contract had revealed the worst possible truth about his situation, but it had also given him something infinitely more valuable, proof that the system that had failed him so completely could be held accountable for its crimes, and Harry was determined to make sure that it was. The September morning that marked Harry Potter's first day at Hogwarts under genuinely protective circumstances carried with it possibilities that had seemed impossible just months before. Standing on platform 9 3/4 beside Margaret and Thomas Henderson, Harry felt the complex mixture of excitement and apprehension that should have been natural for any 11-year-old beginning their magical education, but which was revolutionary for someone whose previous experience of institutional authority had been defined entirely by systematic abuse. The platform bustled with the familiar chaos of families seeing their children off to school, but everything felt different now. Parents hugged their children with genuine affection rather than the performative displays Harry had observed from the Dursleys. Siblings exchanged real promises to write, rather than threats disguised as humor. The entire scene represented the kind of normal family dynamics that Harry was still learning to recognize and trust. Margaret Henderson had approached Harry's first term at Hogwarts with the same careful attention to his emotional well-being that had characterized every aspect of his placement with their family. She had arranged meetings with the new headmistress, Professor McGonagall, to ensure that appropriate support systems would be in place to help him navigate the social and academic challenges of magical education while continuing his recovery from systematic trauma. The changes at Hogwarts itself were dramatic and comprehensive. The school's Board of Governors had implemented sweeping reforms designed to ensure that the institutional failures that had enabled Dumbledore's systematic abuse could never be repeated. Independent oversight bodies now monitored all aspects of student welfare, while mandatory reporting requirements ensured that any concerns about child protection would be immediately investigated by qualified professionals. Professor McGonagall had been selected as the new headmistress specifically for her record of integrity and her commitment to genuine student welfare. Her first actions had included establishing a comprehensive student advocacy system, expanding mental health resources, and implementing transparency measures that would prevent the kind of secretive decision-making that had characterized Dumbledore's administration. But perhaps most importantly, she had personally committed to ensuring that Harry's experience at Hogwarts would be defined by educational opportunity and social connection rather than the political manipulation and emotional isolation that had been planned for him under the previous regime. Her letter to the Henderson family had been both professional and genuinely caring, reflecting her understanding that Harry's successful integration into normal school life was crucial to his continued healing. The train journey to Hogwarts provided Harry with his first real opportunity to interact with magical children his own age outside the context of legal proceedings and media attention. The compartment he shared with Luna Lovegood and 2 other first-year students became a space where he could practice the social skills that systematic isolation had prevented him from developing naturally. Luna's presence was both comforting and challenging, offering the stability of established friendship while encouraging him to engage with new people and experiences. Her characteristic directness proved invaluable in navigating the complex social dynamics that emerged when other students recognized Harry as the child whose courage had exposed the systematic abuse scandal. Some students approached him with the kind of morbid curiosity that focused on the details of his suffering rather than his resilience in overcoming it. Others seemed to view him as a celebrity whose traumatic experiences had somehow transformed him into someone fundamentally different from ordinary children. But gradually, Harry began to encounter peers who were able to see past the public narrative to recognize him as simply another 11-year-old trying to find his place in an unfamiliar environment. Neville Longbottom proved to be one of those peers whose response to Harry's story was characterized by genuine empathy rather than sensational interest. His own experiences with family trauma had given him insights into the complexities of recovering from systematic emotional abuse, and his quiet support became invaluable as Harry navigated the challenges of normal social interaction. The friendship that developed between Harry, Luna, and Neville was built on mutual respect and shared understanding rather than the kind of power dynamics or transactional relationships that Harry had learned to expect from his interactions with adults. For the first time in his life, he experienced the possibility of relationships based on genuine affection and common interests rather than duty, fear, or financial incentive. The academic aspects of magical education proved to be both challenging and liberating for Harry. Years of systematic educational neglect by the Dursleys had left significant gaps in his basic knowledge, but the specialized tutoring that Margaret Henderson had arranged during the summer had helped him develop the study skills and confidence necessary to succeed in a demanding academic environment. More importantly, Harry discovered that learning could be a source of joy and personal fulfillment, rather than simply another arena where adults could demonstrate their power over him. The magic that he had been taught to suppress and fear revealed itself as a natural extension of his capabilities, something to be developed and celebrated, rather than hidden and punished. Professor McGonagall had personally overseen Harry's integration into Gryffindor House, ensuring that his dormitory placement and class schedule would provide appropriate support while avoiding the kind of special treatment that might have isolated him from his peers. Her approach was both protective and normalizing, creating space for him to heal while encouraging him to engage fully with the educational opportunities that Hogwarts provided. The transformation of the school's culture was evident in countless small details that reflected the new administration's commitment to genuine student welfare. House point systems had been reformed to emphasize collaboration and academic achievement rather than favoritism and political manipulation. Disciplinary procedures had been restructured to ensure proportionality and educational value rather than the arbitrary punishment that had characterized the previous regime. But perhaps most significantly, the entire philosophy underlying magical education had been re-examined and reformed. Students were encouraged to develop their individual talents and interests, rather than being molded to serve predetermined institutional purposes. The comfortable assumption that educators knew what was best for children had been replaced by approaches that valued student voice and agency in determining their own educational goals. Harry's first term at Hogwarts was marked by a series of small victories that represented enormous progress in his personal development. Successfully completing his first essay for Professor Flitwick's Charms class demonstrated his ability to engage with academic challenges. Participating in his first Quidditch practice showed that he could pursue interests and activities simply because they brought him joy. Making friends who valued him for his personal qualities rather than his public notoriety proved that normal social relationships were possible despite his traumatic history. But perhaps most importantly, Harry began to develop a sense of his own identity that was not defined primarily by what had been done to him. The systematic abuse that had shaped his early years remained an important part of his story, but it was no longer the only part. He was beginning to understand himself as someone who had survived terrible experiences and chosen to use that survival as the foundation for helping others, but who was also simply a young person with interests, preferences, and possibilities that extended far beyond his traumatic past. The autumn term brought opportunities for Harry to engage directly with the broader movement for child protection reform that his case had inspired. Mrs. Whitmore had arranged for him to participate in selected conferences and symposiums where his insights could contribute to the ongoing development of new policies and procedures designed to prevent future systematic abuse. These appearances were carefully managed to protect Harry's privacy and emotional well-being, while allowing him to maintain his role as an advocate for vulnerable children. His testimony was always voluntary, his participation always supported by appropriate counseling and legal representation, and his right to withdraw from public engagement at any time was consistently respected and protected. The response to Harry's continued advocacy was overwhelmingly positive, with child protection professionals throughout the magical world expressing gratitude for his ongoing commitment to ensuring that the reforms inspired by his case would be properly implemented and sustained. His unique perspective, as both survivor and catalyst, provided insights that were invaluable for developing effective policies and procedures. But Harry was also careful to maintain boundaries between his advocacy work and his personal life, ensuring that his commitment to protecting other children did not come at the expense of his own education and development. The balance was delicate and required constant attention, but the support systems that had been established around him made it possible to pursue both goals simultaneously. The Henderson family had become the stable foundation that allowed Harry to engage with public advocacy while maintaining the privacy and normalcy that were essential to his continued healing. Their home remained a sanctuary where he could simply be a child, pursuing ordinary interests and relationships without the constant pressure of public attention or institutional expectations. Margaret Henderson's background in education proved invaluable in helping Harry navigate the academic and social challenges of Hogwarts, while maintaining perspective on his broader goals and responsibilities. She attended parent conferences with the same engaged attention she would have shown for any of her children, treating his educational progress as important in its own right, rather than simply as preparation for future advocacy work. Thomas Henderson's work with the Department of Child Protection and Advocacy provided valuable insights into the ongoing implementation of the reforms that Harry's case had inspired. His reports about policy development and program evaluation helped Harry understand the broader impact of his courage in speaking out, while reinforcing his sense of connection to the children who were benefiting from the new protections. The winter holidays provided Harry with his first experience of genuine family celebration, complete with traditions that were meaningful rather than performative, and gifts that reflected genuine attention to his interests and preferences rather than dutiful obligation. The contrast with his previous experiences was so stark that he sometimes felt overwhelmed by the simple kindness of being included in family rituals as a valued participant rather than an unwelcome observer. Christmas morning at the Henderson home was marked by the kind of relaxed joy that Harry had observed in other families, but never experienced himself. Presents were exchanged with genuine pleasure, meals were prepared and shared with everyone, contributing according to their abilities and interests, and conversation flowed naturally around topics of mutual concern and affection. But perhaps most significantly, Harry was encouraged to express his own preferences and traditions, contributing to the family's celebration rather than simply receiving their charity. His suggestions for holiday activities were treated as seriously as anyone else's, his dietary preferences were accommodated without resentment, and his emotional responses to the various festivities were respected and supported rather than judged or criticized. The new year brought news that demonstrated the lasting impact of the child protection reforms that Harry's case had inspired. International monitoring reports showed significant improvements in magical child welfare systems throughout Europe, with systematic abuse cases dropping dramatically as new oversight mechanisms and advocacy services were implemented and refined. Perhaps most importantly, the number of children coming forward to report concerns about their own safety and welfare had increased substantially, suggesting that the reforms were not just preventing new abuses, but also creating pathways for children who were currently at risk to access appropriate protection and support. The culture of silence and institutional deference that had enabled systematic abuse was being replaced by systems that prioritized children's voices and experiences. Harry's continued advocacy work during his first year at Hogwarts focused particularly on supporting other child survivors who were navigating their own recovery processes. His unique perspective as someone who had not only survived systematic abuse, but had successfully challenged the institutions responsible for it, made him an invaluable mentor and role model for children who were just beginning their own journeys toward healing and empowerment. The mentoring relationships he developed were carefully structured to protect both Harry and the children he was supporting, with appropriate professional oversight and regular evaluation to ensure that the interactions remained beneficial for everyone involved. But within those boundaries, Harry was able to provide the kind of peer support and understanding that could not be replicated by even the most skilled professional counselors. Spring term brought new challenges and opportunities as Harry's academic performance and social integration continued to improve. His grades reflected genuine engagement with his studies rather than simply compliance with institutional expectations, while his friendships deepened into the kind of lasting relationships that would provide support and connection throughout his life. The relationship with Luna had evolved into something that might have been described as first love, though both were careful not to rush into romantic commitments that might complicate their ongoing recovery and development. Their connection was based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection, providing a foundation that could support whatever direction their relationship might take in the future. Neville's friendship had proven equally valuable, offering the kind of steady, reliable support that helped Harry navigate the ordinary challenges of adolescence while maintaining perspective on the extraordinary circumstances that had shaped his early experiences. Their shared commitment to protecting vulnerable children provided common ground for activities and interests that extended far beyond their traumatic histories. As Harry's first year at Hogwarts drew to a close, he reflected on the extraordinary changes that had occurred in his life since that terrifying night when he had discovered the contract in Vernon's study. The systematic abuse that had defined his childhood had been exposed, prosecuted, and transformed into the foundation for comprehensive reforms that were protecting children throughout the magical world. But perhaps more importantly, Harry had learned that recovery from systematic trauma was not just about surviving or even about seeking justice, but about building a life that was meaningful and fulfilling in its own right. The courage he had shown in speaking out about his experiences had created opportunities not just for legal accountability, but for personal growth and development that would have been impossible under the old system. The final exams of his first year represented more than academic achievement. They were a demonstration of his ability to engage fully with the educational opportunities that had been denied to him for so long. His success in defense against the dark arts, transfiguration, and charms reflected not just academic ability, but the confidence and resilience that had enabled him to overcome the systematic efforts to break his spirit. As the Hogwarts Express carried him back to London and the Henderson family home that had become his true sanctuary, Harry Potter understood that he had not simply survived his traumatic childhood, but had transformed it into the foundation for a life dedicated to protecting others and building a better world. The contract that had revealed the worst possible truth about his situation had become the catalyst for changes that would benefit generations of magical children who would grow up in a world where their voices were heard, their welfare was protected, and their potential was nurtured rather than systematically destroyed. The journey from victim to survivor to advocate was complete, but the work of building a better future was just beginning. And Harry Potter, no longer alone and no longer powerless, was ready to face whatever challenges that future might bring. The June morning that marked Harry Potter's graduation from Hogwarts carried with it the weight of 7 years that had transformed not just his own life, but the entire structure of magical child protection throughout Europe and beyond. Standing in the great hall surrounded by classmates who had become genuine friends, Harry reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him from systematic abuse to academic achievement, from isolation to community, from victim to advocate, whose work had reshaped the world he was preparing to enter as an adult. The ceremony itself was conducted under the new traditions that Professor McGonagall had established during her tenure as headmistress, emphasizing individual achievement and collaborative learning rather than the house rivalries and favoritism that had characterized the previous regime. Students were recognized not just for academic excellence, but for contributions to their communities, for leadership in protecting vulnerable peers, and for the kind of moral courage that had once been rare, but was now actively cultivated and celebrated. Harry's own achievements during his 7 years at Hogwarts represented far more than academic success, though his performance in defense against the dark arts, transfiguration, and magical law had been consistently outstanding. More significantly, his continued advocacy work had evolved into a comprehensive program that provided support and mentoring for other survivors of systematic abuse, while contributing to the ongoing refinement of child protection policies throughout the magical world. The International Center for Magical Child Protection, which Harry had helped establish during his 5th year, had become a model for similar institutions throughout Europe and North America. Its combination of direct services for at-risk children, training programs for child welfare professionals, and research initiatives focused on preventing institutional abuse had transformed the landscape of magical child protection in ways that would benefit generations of children who would never know his name. Margaret and Thomas Henderson sat in the family section, with the kind of quiet pride that reflected their understanding of how far Harry had come from the traumatized child who had first entered their home. Their decision to adopt him had provided the stable foundation that made all his subsequent achievements possible, but they had also learned from his experiences in ways that had made them better advocates for all the children in their care. The Henderson family had grown over the years to include 3 other adopted children who had survived various forms of institutional abuse, creating a household where recovery and resilience were not just individual goals, but shared values that shaped every aspect of family life. Harry's role as an older sibling had provided him with opportunities to practice the kind of protective care and emotional support that had been absent from his own childhood, helping him understand that healing was not just about overcoming trauma, but about building relationships based on genuine love and mutual respect. Luna Lovegood sat with her father in the section reserved for close friends, her presence representing one of the most significant relationships in Harry's life. Their connection had evolved over the years from childhood friendship to adolescent romance to the kind of deep partnership that was based on shared values, mutual support, and genuine understanding of each other's experiences and goals. Their relationship had been characterized by the kind of careful attention to both individual autonomy and mutual support that reflected their understanding of how power dynamics could be corrupted by those who sought to control rather than nurture. Both had learned from their experiences with institutional abuse to value relationships that enhanced rather than diminished their individual capabilities and aspirations. The wedding that was planned for the following month would represent not just personal commitment, but symbolic validation of the principle that love could indeed triumph over the systematic efforts to isolate and control vulnerable children. Their partnership had become a source of strength for both of them, while serving as a model for other survivors who were learning to build healthy relationships despite their traumatic histories. Neville Longbottom had developed into one of Harry's closest friends and most trusted colleagues, their shared experiences of recovering from family trauma having created bonds that had only strengthened over the years. His decision to pursue advanced studies in magical psychology had been directly inspired by Harry's advocacy work, and his research into the long-term effects of systematic child abuse was contributing to improved treatment approaches throughout the magical medical community. The friendship between Harry, Luna, and Neville had become the foundation for a broader network of advocates and reformers who were continuing the work of transforming magical society's approach to protecting vulnerable children. Their collaboration had produced policy proposals, training programs, and direct service initiatives that were being implemented throughout Europe and beyond. Hermione Granger had joined their group during their 3rd year at Hogwarts. Her exceptional analytical abilities and passionate commitment to social justice making her an invaluable contributor to their advocacy efforts. Her parents had been among the first mundane professionals to offer their expertise in support of magical child protection reform, and their work had helped establish the kind of cross-jurisdictional cooperation that was essential for addressing problems that transcended traditional boundaries. The speech that Harry delivered as valedictorian reflected his understanding that individual achievement was meaningful only when it contributed to broader goals of social justice and institutional reform. He spoke about the responsibility that came with privilege, the importance of using personal success as a platform for protecting others, and the ongoing work that was needed to ensure that the reforms inspired by his case would be sustained and strengthened rather than gradually eroded by those who preferred the convenience of the old system. But perhaps most importantly, he spoke about hope, about the possibility of transformation that existed even in the most dire circumstances, and about the power of individual courage to create changes that extended far beyond personal benefit. His words carried the authority of someone who had not only survived systematic abuse, but had chosen to use that survival as the foundation for building a better world. The audience that listened to Harry's speech included representatives from magical governments throughout Europe, child protection professionals from dozens of countries, and survivors of institutional abuse who had found their own voices through the movement that his courage had inspired. The presence of such diverse constituencies reflected the international scope of the changes that had been implemented over the past 7 years. James Whitmore, now serving as the Director of International Magical Child Protection Law, had travelled from Geneva to attend the ceremony that marked the graduation of the young man whose case had launched his current career. His work with the International Criminal Court had resulted in comprehensive legal frameworks that were now being used to prosecute child abuse cases throughout the magical world, while his training programs were ensuring that future generations of child protection professionals would be better equipped to prevent and respond to systematic abuse. Mrs. Whitmore, whose library networks had provided crucial support during the early stages of Harry's case, had established a foundation that was working to ensure that vulnerable children throughout the world had access to safe spaces and reliable adults who could provide both immediate sanctuary and long-term advocacy. Her understanding of the importance of community resources in protecting at-risk children had led to programs that were being replicated in magical communities around the globe. The afternoon following graduation was marked by a series of private celebrations that reflected the various communities that had supported Harry throughout his journey from abuse to advocacy. The Henderson family hosted a gathering that included everyone who had played significant roles in his recovery and development, creating an opportunity for reflection and gratitude that acknowledged how far he had come while recognizing the ongoing work that lay ahead. The conversation that flowed through the Henderson home that afternoon was characterized by the kind of easy affection and mutual respect that had taken Harry years to learn to recognize and trust. Adults and young people interacted as equals, whose different perspectives and experiences were valued rather than hierarchically arranged according to age or authority. The atmosphere was one of celebration, but also of renewed commitment to the principles that had guided their shared work. Professor McGonagall had joined the celebration with obvious pleasure at seeing how successfully Harry had integrated into normal family and community life. Her decision to accept the position of headmistress had been motivated primarily by her commitment to ensuring that Hogwarts would never again serve as a cover for the kind of institutional abuse that had characterized the previous administration, and Harry's success was validation of the comprehensive reforms she had implemented. The changes at Hogwarts during Harry's 7 years there had been profound and lasting, transforming the school from an institution that prioritized political convenience over student welfare into a genuine educational community that valued individual development and social responsibility. The student advocacy programs, enhanced mental health resources, and comprehensive oversight mechanisms that had been established were now being adopted by magical schools throughout Europe. Kingsley Shacklebolt, whose integrity and commitment to reform had made him an effective minister for magic, had overseen the implementation of comprehensive child protection reforms that extended far beyond the specific failures that had enabled Harry's abuse. His administration had established new standards for transparency, accountability, and professional competence that were transforming the culture of magical government in ways that would benefit all citizens, but particularly those who were most vulnerable to institutional abuse. The evening concluded with the announcement that had been anticipated by everyone who understood the trajectory of Harry's personal and professional development. He had been accepted to the Advanced International Program in Child Protection Law and Policy, a joint program administered by the International Confederation of Wizards and the European Court of Human Rights that would prepare him for leadership roles in the ongoing work of reforming magical child protection systems throughout the world. The program represented the culmination of years of academic preparation and practical experience, but it also represented the beginning of Harry's adult career as an advocate and reformer. His unique perspective as both survivor and catalyst would provide invaluable insights for developing policies and procedures that could prevent future systematic abuse, while supporting children who had already been harmed by institutional failures. But perhaps more importantly, his participation in the program would ensure that the reforms inspired by his case would continue to evolve and strengthen rather than stagnating or being gradually undermined by those who preferred the convenience of less rigorous oversight. His ongoing involvement would serve as a constant reminder of why the reforms had been necessary and what was at stake if they were not properly maintained and strengthened. The wedding that followed Harry's graduation was conducted according to traditions that Luna and Harry had designed to reflect their shared values and experiences. The ceremony emphasized partnership and mutual support rather than traditional hierarchies, with both families contributing equally to celebrations that honored their individual histories while looking forward to their shared future. The guest list reflected the diverse communities that had supported both Harry and Luna throughout their recovery and development, creating an opportunity for people from different backgrounds and professions to come together in celebration of principles that transcended their individual circumstances. Child protection professionals, educators, government officials, and ordinary families who had been touched by their advocacy work joined together in recognizing not just personal happiness, but symbolic validation of the possibility of healing and growth. The vows that Harry and Luna exchanged were personal and specific, reflecting their understanding of how relationships could be sources of strength and growth rather than control and manipulation. Their commitment to each other was framed within a broader commitment to the work they would continue to share, ensuring that their partnership would enhance rather than compete with their individual contributions to child protection reform. The reception that followed was characterized by the kind of joyful celebration that had been absent from Harry's life for so many years, but which he had learned to recognize and embrace as a natural expression of human connection and community. The music, food, and conversation flowed with the easy warmth that comes from gathering people who genuinely care about each other and share common values and goals. But perhaps most significantly, the celebration included several of the children who had been rescued from abusive placements as a direct result of the reforms that Harry's case had inspired. Their presence served as a living reminder of why the work had been important and why it needed to continue, while their obvious health and happiness provided powerful testimony to the possibility of recovery and growth even after systematic trauma. As the evening progressed and the formal celebration gave way to quieter conversations among smaller groups, Harry found himself reflecting on the extraordinary changes that had occurred in his life and in the broader magical world since that terrifying night when he had discovered the contract in Vernon's study. The systematic abuse that had defined his childhood had been transformed into the foundation for comprehensive reforms that were protecting children throughout the magical world. But more importantly, he had learned that recovery from systematic trauma was not just about individual healing, but about building communities and institutions that valued and protected the most vulnerable members of society. His personal journey from victim to survivor to advocate had been paralleled by broader social changes that reflected a fundamental shift in how magical society understood its responsibilities to its children. The honeymoon that Harry and Luna took to various magical communities throughout Europe provided opportunities to observe firsthand the implementation of the child protection reforms that had been inspired by Harry's case. They visited schools, family service agencies, and advocacy organizations that were working to ensure that vulnerable children had access to protection and support, while also contributing their own expertise to ongoing program development and refinement. The responses they encountered were overwhelmingly positive, with child protection professionals expressing gratitude for the leadership and vision that had made comprehensive reform possible. But they also encountered challenges and resistance that served as reminders that the work of protecting vulnerable children required constant vigilance and ongoing commitment from everyone involved. As Harry and Luna returned from their honeymoon to begin their advanced studies and continued advocacy work, they understood that they were not just building a life together, but contributing to a movement that would define how magical society treated its most vulnerable members for generations to come. The contract that had revealed the worst possible truth about Harry's childhood had become the foundation for building something infinitely better, something that would ensure no child would suffer in silence while adults argued about procedures and convenience. The legacy they were building together was not just personal, but institutional, creating lasting changes that would protect children they would never meet in circumstances they could only imagine. The transformation from individual trauma to collective action was complete, but the work of building a better future was just beginning, and Harry Potter, no longer alone and no longer powerless, was ready to face whatever challenges that future might bring. The autumn morning that marked Harry Potter's 20th anniversary as Director of International Magical Child Protection carried with it the weight of 2 decades that had fundamentally transformed how magical society understood its obligations to its most vulnerable members. Standing in his office overlooking the International Magical Cooperation Building in Geneva, Harry reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him from a terrified 9-year-old, clutching evidence of systematic betrayal, to a position where his decisions influenced the lives of magical children throughout the world. The office itself reflected the values that had guided his work for 2 decades. The walls were covered not with awards or official photographs, but with letters from children whose lives had been changed by the protections his advocacy had helped establish. Drawings from young witches and wizards who had found safety in the family placement programs he had designed. Thank you notes from teenagers who had graduated from the residential treatment centers that provided specialized care for survivors of institutional abuse. But perhaps most meaningful of all was the original contract that had started everything, now preserved in a place of honor, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of why the work remained necessary. The document that had once seemed like evidence of ultimate betrayal had become a symbol of the possibility of transformation, proof that even the most systematic cruelty could be challenged and overcome by those who refused to accept that suffering was inevitable or justified. The morning's agenda included meetings with representatives from magical governments throughout Europe and North America, all working to implement the latest refinements to child protection protocols that had evolved from 2 decades of experience and research. The systems that had emerged from Harry's initial case were now sophisticated, comprehensive, and most importantly, effective at preventing the kind of systematic abuse that had once been hidden within bureaucratic structures. Luna arrived as she always did on significant anniversaries, carrying tea and the kind of quiet understanding that had sustained their partnership through 2 decades of shared commitment to protecting vulnerable children. Her own work as a researcher and policy analyst had been instrumental in developing evidence-based approaches to child protection that balanced immediate safety needs with long-term developmental goals. Their marriage had become a model for relationships built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine partnership in work that extended far beyond personal satisfaction. The children they had raised together, both biological and adopted, had grown up understanding that families were created through love and commitment rather than legal obligation, and that the most important work anyone could do was protecting those who could not protect themselves. James Whitmore arrived for their scheduled meeting with the measured dignity that had characterized his approach to child protection law throughout his distinguished career. Now serving as Chief Justice for the International Court of Magical Child Protection, his work had established legal precedents that were being used to prosecute abuse cases and implement reforms throughout the magical world. The court system he had helped establish represented a fundamental shift in how magical society approached child welfare issues. Cases were decided not by political appointees or bureaucratic convenience, but by professionals whose expertise and independence ensured that children's interests remained paramount, regardless of institutional pressure or political considerations. "Margaret," Harry said, as Mrs. Whitmore entered the office with her characteristic combination of professional competence and maternal warmth. "I have been thinking about our conversation last week regarding the anniversary exhibition. I believe we have reached a point where the full story can be told without compromising the privacy of those who deserve protection." Mrs. Whitmore nodded thoughtfully, her expression reflecting years of careful consideration about how to balance historical accuracy with appropriate sensitivity to survivors who preferred to keep their stories private. The exhibition she had been developing for the Museum of Magical History would provide comprehensive documentation of the systematic abuse scandal that had transformed magical child protection. But it would do so in ways that honored survivors' dignity, while ensuring that future generations understood why vigilance remained necessary. The planning for the exhibition had taken years, involving extensive consultation with survivors, child protection professionals, and historians who understood the importance of accurate documentation. The goal was not simply to catalogue past failures, but to demonstrate how individual courage could indeed create lasting institutional change when properly supported and strategically applied. The centerpiece of the exhibition would be the original contract, displayed alongside documentation of the comprehensive reforms it had inspired. Visitors would be able to trace the complete arc, from discovery to exposure to systematic change, understanding how one child's refusal to accept that suffering was normal had created protections that now benefited children throughout the magical world. But perhaps more importantly, the exhibition would include interactive elements that would help visitors understand their own role in maintaining the vigilance necessary to prevent future systematic abuse. Children would learn about their rights and how to report concerns about their own safety or the safety of their peers. Adults would learn about their responsibilities to protect vulnerable children and how to recognize signs that intervention might be necessary. Neville Longbottom joined the meeting as the newly appointed director of the International Institute for Magical Child Psychology, his research into the long-term effects of systematic abuse having revolutionized treatment approaches throughout the magical medical community. His work had demonstrated that recovery from even the most severe trauma was possible when appropriate support systems were available, while also documenting the institutional changes necessary to prevent future abuse. The institute he now directed was conducting research that would inform child protection policies for generations to come. Studies of resilience factors that helped some children survive systematic abuse better than others were leading to improved screening and support protocols. Research into the effectiveness of different therapeutic approaches was ensuring that treatment resources were allocated in ways that maximized benefits for survivors. Hermione arrived with her usual armload of research reports and policy proposals, her work as Deputy Director for International Magical Child Protection Policy having made her one of the most influential advocates for vulnerable children in the magical world. Her analytical approach to complex problems had been instrumental in developing evidence-based policies that balanced idealistic goals with practical constraints. The policy framework she had developed was now being used throughout Europe and North America as the standard for comprehensive child protection systems. Her work had demonstrated that preventing systematic abuse required not just good intentions, but sophisticated understanding of how institutions could be structured to prioritize children's welfare while maintaining appropriate accountability and oversight. The annual memorial service that concluded each anniversary week had evolved into a significant gathering that brought together survivors, advocates, and ordinary citizens who understood the importance of maintaining vigilance in protecting vulnerable children. The service honored not just those who had survived systematic abuse, but also those who had not, ensuring that their suffering was remembered and that their deaths contributed to understanding of why comprehensive protection systems were necessary. Harry's speech at this year's memorial service reflected his understanding that the work of protecting vulnerable children was never complete, that each generation had to recommit itself to the principles and practices that prevented institutional abuse. The comfortable assumption that past reforms were sufficient to prevent future problems had to be constantly challenged by evidence-based assessment of current systems and their effectiveness. The statistics he presented demonstrated both the successes and the ongoing challenges facing magical child protection systems. The number of children in abusive placements had dropped dramatically over the past 2 decades, while reports of concern were being investigated more quickly and thoroughly than ever before. But new challenges had emerged that required constant adaptation and refinement of protective systems. The international scope of the child protection movement that had emerged from Harry's case was evident in the diversity of the audience that attended the memorial service. Representatives from magical governments throughout the world, child protection professionals from dozens of countries, and survivors from every continent had gathered to renew their commitment to the principles that Harry's courage had helped establish. But perhaps most significantly, the audience included hundreds of children and young adults whose lives had been directly improved by the protections that had emerged from the systematic abuse scandal. Their presence served as living testimony to the possibility of transformation and the importance of maintaining the vigilance necessary to protect future generations. The afternoon brought a private gathering at the Henderson family home, which had remained Harry's sanctuary and spiritual center throughout 2 decades of public advocacy. Margaret and Thomas Henderson, now in their 70s, continued to provide foster care for children who needed specialized support, their experience and wisdom making them invaluable resources for the broader child protection community. The Henderson home had become a symbol of what was possible when adults committed themselves to genuinely caring for children rather than simply managing them. The dozens of young people who had found safety and support there over the years had gone on to their own successful lives while maintaining connections to the family that had given them their first experience of unconditional love and acceptance. The conversation that flowed through the Henderson home that afternoon was characterized by the same easy affection and mutual respect that had marked Harry's first experience of genuine family life. 3 generations of children who had found safety there were present, creating an opportunity for reflection on how individual acts of kindness could create ripple effects that extended far beyond immediate beneficiaries. Luna's pregnancy with their 3rd child had been announced earlier that week, creating another opportunity for celebration and renewed commitment to building a world where children could grow up safely and happily. Their decision to have biological children alongside the adopted children they were raising reflected their understanding that families were created through love and commitment rather than genetic connection. The children they were raising together represented the future that Harry's advocacy had been designed to protect. They were growing up in a world where their voices were heard and respected, where their safety was prioritized above institutional convenience, and where they understood their own responsibility to protect other children who might be vulnerable to abuse or neglect. As evening approached, Harry found himself in the garden behind the Henderson home, the same space where he had first begun to understand that recovery from systematic abuse was possible. The conversation with Luna that had taken place there during his first term at Hogwarts had been instrumental in helping him understand that his commitment to protecting other children was not just professional obligation, but personal calling. The speech he would deliver the following day at the Museum of Magical History had been years in preparation, representing his most comprehensive reflection on the journey from individual trauma to institutional transformation. The permanent exhibition that would be unveiled would provide future generations with comprehensive documentation of how one child's courage had created lasting change throughout the magical world. But perhaps more importantly, the exhibition would serve as a challenge to visitors to consider their own role in maintaining the protections that had been established and developing new approaches to emerging challenges. The comfortable assumption that past reforms were sufficient to prevent future problems would be directly confronted by evidence that vigilance and continued commitment were necessary to protect vulnerable children. The text of his speech had been carefully crafted to honor those who had suffered while inspiring continued commitment to the work of protection and advocacy. Harry had learned over the years that effective advocacy required not just documentation of past failures, but articulation of positive vision for what was possible when communities committed themselves to protecting their most vulnerable members. The morning of the exhibition opening brought representatives from magical governments throughout the world, child protection professionals from every continent, and hundreds of survivors whose courage in sharing their stories had contributed to the comprehensive understanding of systematic abuse that made prevention possible. The exhibition itself was comprehensive and carefully designed to provide visitors with both historical context and practical understanding of current child protection systems. Interactive displays allowed visitors to experience decision-making processes that child protection professionals use to assess and respond to reports of concern. Educational materials helped both children and adults understand their rights and responsibilities within reformed systems, but the emotional center of the exhibition remained the original contract, displayed with appropriate context that helped visitors understand both its historical significance and its continuing relevance as a reminder of why vigilance remained necessary. The document that had once seemed like evidence of ultimate betrayal was now presented as proof that even the most systematic cruelty could be challenged and overcome. The speech that Harry delivered at the opening ceremony reflected 2 decades of experience in child protection advocacy, combining personal reflection with policy analysis and practical recommendations for continued improvement. His words carried the authority of someone who had not only survived systematic abuse, but had dedicated his life to ensuring that future generations would be better protected. The audience that listened to Harry's speech represented the international community that had emerged from his individual case, a network of professionals, advocates, and ordinary citizens who understood that protecting vulnerable children was one of the most important responsibilities any society could undertake. Their presence demonstrated the lasting impact of individual courage when properly supported and strategically applied. The final section of Harry's speech addressed the young people in the audience, particularly those who might be experiencing abuse or neglect in their own lives. His message was simple but profound. Your suffering is not acceptable. Your voice matters, and there are adults who will believe you and protect you if you have the courage to speak out. But he also spoke to the adults in the audience, reminding them that protecting children was not just the responsibility of specialized professionals, but of everyone who encountered young people in their daily lives. Teachers, neighbors, family members, and ordinary citizens all had roles to play in maintaining the vigilance necessary to prevent systematic abuse. As the ceremony concluded and visitors began exploring the exhibition, Harry found himself surrounded by the people who had supported his journey from terrified victim to international advocate. Mrs. Whitmore, whose library had provided his first sanctuary, was documenting the responses of visitors who were learning about the history they had helped create. James Whitmore was discussing legal precedents with international colleagues who were implementing similar reforms in their own countries. The Henderson family was present, with several generations of children they had fostered, creating a living demonstration of how individual acts of kindness could create lasting change in the lives of vulnerable young people. Luna was coordinating with museum staff to ensure that the educational programs associated with the exhibition would be accessible to children throughout the magical world. But perhaps most significantly, several of the children who had been rescued from abusive placements as direct results of the reforms Harry's case had inspired were present as young adults, their obvious success and happiness providing powerful testimony to the possibility of recovery and growth even after systematic trauma. As the day progressed and the formal opening gave way to quieter conversations and more intimate reflections, Harry found himself thinking about the 9-year-old boy who had discovered the contract in Vernon's study so many years before. That terrified child could never have imagined the comprehensive transformation that would emerge from his decision to flee into the darkness rather than accept that suffering was inevitable. The evening concluded with a private dinner that brought together the core group of advocates who had supported Harry's work throughout 2 decades of systematic reform. The conversation was marked by both celebration of what had been accomplished and renewed commitment to the work that remained to be done. The challenges facing child protection systems continued to evolve, requiring constant adaptation and refinement of policies and procedures. New forms of abuse emerged as technology and social structures changed. Different cultural contexts required different approaches to protection and support. The work was never complete, but the foundation that had been laid was strong enough to support whatever adaptations might be necessary. As Harry and Luna walked home through the streets of Geneva, past the buildings that housed the international institutions their work had helped create, they reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them from childhood trauma to adult partnership in work that would define their lives and benefit children throughout the world. The contract that had shattered Harry's understanding of his childhood had become the foundation for protections that would benefit generations of children who would never know his name, but would live safer lives because of his courage in speaking out. The transformation from individual trauma to collective action was complete, but the work of maintaining and strengthening those protections would continue for as long as children needed adults who were willing to fight for their safety and well-being. The final entry in Harry's journal that night reflected his understanding that the most important legacy anyone could leave was not personal achievement, but contribution to systems and institutions that would protect and nurture future generations. The contract that had revealed the worst possible truth about his situation had become the catalyst for building something infinitely better, something that would ensure no child would suffer in silence while adults argued about procedures and convenience. 20 years after discovering that document in Vernon's study, Harry Potter understood that his greatest achievement was not surviving systematic abuse, but transforming that survival into lasting protection for children he would never meet, in circumstances he could only imagine. The work would continue, but the foundation for justice had been laid with the bedrock of individual courage and sustained by the commitment of people who believed that protecting children was the most important responsibility any society could undertake. The night air carried a chill that cut through Harry's thin pajamas like ice, but he barely noticed as he stumbled down Privet Drive, clutching the rolled contract against his chest. His bare feet slapped against the cold pavement, each step taking him further from the house that had never been a home, and deeper into an uncertain darkness that somehow felt safer than the malevolent warmth he had left behind. Behind him, the windows of number 4 blazed with light as Vernon's bellowing voice carried through the still air, demanding to know where that ungrateful brat had hidden himself. Harry could hear Aunt Petunia's shrill responses, her tone oscillating between panic and fury as she joined the search, but their voices grew fainter with each desperate step, until they were nothing more than an angry buzz that the night wind carried away like smoke. Harry's lungs burned as he forced himself to keep moving, his body protesting the sudden demand for speed after a day of grinding labor. But terror drove him forward with relentless efficiency, the kind of pure survival instinct that had kept him alive through 9 years of systematic cruelty. He had no destination in mind, no plan beyond the overwhelming need to put distance between himself and the Dursleys before they discovered what he had found. The residential streets of Little Whinging were eerily quiet at this hour, their neat rows of identical houses standing like sleeping sentinels in the moonlight. Occasionally, a dog would bark at his passing, or a security light would flicker on to illuminate his flight, but no human stirred to investigate the small figure running through their orderly world like a ghost fleeing daylight. It was only when his legs began to shake with exhaustion that Harry realized he needed shelter, somewhere he could rest and think and try to process the magnitude of what he had discovered. The contract felt impossibly heavy in his arms, its weight seeming to increase with each step, as though the terrible secrets it contained were adding physical mass to the parchment. Ahead of him, the familiar bulk of the Little Whinging Public Library rose from behind its screen of carefully maintained hedges. Harry had passed it countless times during his rare forays beyond Privet Drive, usually while running errands for Aunt Petunia or walking to and from school. But he had never been inside, of course. The Dursleys had made it clear that libraries were for proper children with proper families, not for freaks who should be grateful for any education they received at all. But tonight, desperation overrode years of conditioning. The building offered shelter and anonymity, and perhaps most importantly, it represented a space that belonged to no one Harry knew. If he could just find a way inside, he might have a chance to examine the contract more carefully, to understand fully what had been done to him and what it might mean for his future. The main entrance was locked, of course, but Harry's years of navigating Privet Drive after dark had taught him to notice details that others might miss. There, on the side of the building partially hidden by an overgrown hedge, was a window that had been left slightly ajar to provide ventilation. It was barely wide enough for someone Harry's size to squeeze through, but desperation provided both motivation and flexibility. The drop from the window to the library floor was further than Harry had anticipated, and he landed hard enough to send jarring pain through his already aching joints. But he was inside, surrounded by the distinctive smell of old paper and binding glue that seemed to permeate all libraries, regardless of their age or condition. Emergency lighting provided just enough illumination to reveal the shadowy outlines of tall shelves stretching away into the darkness like the ribs of some enormous sleeping creature. Harry made his way deeper into the building, instinctively seeking the most secluded corner he could find. His bare feet made no sound on the carpeted floor, and soon he found himself in what appeared to be a children's section, surrounded by low shelves filled with picture books and beginning readers. There, nestled between two tall stacks of returned volumes waiting to be reshelved, Harry finally allowed himself to stop and catch his breath. The silence was profound in a way that Harry had rarely experienced. At Privet Drive, there was always something. The hum of appliances, the creak of settling wood, the distant sound of traffic, or the omnipresent tension that seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. But here, wrapped in the protective embrace of thousands of books, Harry found a peace he had not known existed. With trembling fingers, he unrolled the contract once again and held it up to catch what little light filtered through from the emergency fixtures. Reading it a second time did nothing to diminish its impact. If anything, the careful legal language seemed even more sinister in the quiet darkness, each euphemism and carefully crafted phrase revealing new layers of calculated cruelty. The section dealing with behavioral modification through environmental controls was particularly chilling when Harry considered it in light of his own experiences. The locked cupboard, the missed meals, the endless labor disguised as chores, the systematic isolation from anyone who might show him kindness, all of it had been prescribed and funded by the very institutions that were supposed to protect magical children. But it was the signature at the bottom that continued to devastate him most completely. Albus Dumbledore, a name that even Harry recognized as belonging to the most powerful and respected wizard in Britain, had personally authorized his suffering. The man who was supposed to be the champion of light and justice had instead engineered a system designed to break Harry's spirit and ensure his compliance with whatever plans had been made for his future. A soft footstep somewhere in the darkness made Harry's blood freeze in his veins. He quickly rolled up the contract and pressed himself deeper into the shadow between the book stacks, his heart hammering so loudly that he was certain it could be heard throughout the entire building. Had the Dursleys somehow tracked him here? Had someone seen him climbing through the window and called the police? But the footsteps that approached were light and measured, lacking the heavy aggression of Vernon's tread or the sharp efficiency of official authority. Instead, they carried the careful quality of someone trying not to disturb a sacred silence, the kind of reverent approach that belonged to someone who truly loved books and the spaces that housed them. The figure that appeared at the end of the aisle was not what Harry had expected. She was elderly but not frail, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun that spoke of long years of professional competence. Her clothes were sensible rather than fashionable, the kind of carefully maintained garments worn by someone who valued function over appearance. But it was her eyes that captured Harry's attention most completely. Bright and intelligent, and filled with the kind of genuine concern that he had seen so rarely that he had almost forgotten it existed. "Well, hello there," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to dealing with frightened children. "You look as though you have had quite an adventure tonight." Harry pressed himself further back against the shelves, clutching the contract so tightly that the parchment began to crackle under the pressure. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee back into the darkness before this stranger could ask questions he could not answer or make demands he could not meet. But his body betrayed him, exhaustion and emotional shock combining, to leave him trembling and unable to move. The woman seemed to sense his terror, because she made no move to approach him directly. Instead, she settled herself on a small chair that had been left beside one of the reading tables, positioning herself at Harry's level rather than looming over him like the adults he was accustomed to dealing with. "My name is Margaret Whitmore," she continued, her tone remaining calm and reassuring. "I am the head librarian here, and I was just finishing some late cataloguing when I heard someone moving around in the children's section. I must say, you are quite possibly the youngest person I have ever encountered who managed to break into a library rather than out of one." Despite his terror, Harry felt his lips twitch at what might have been the beginning of a smile. There was something about Mrs. Whitmore's matter-of-fact tone that suggested she was not particularly scandalized by finding a 9-year-old boy hiding among the books in the middle of the night. Instead, she seemed to regard it as an interesting puzzle to be solved rather than a crisis to be managed. "I am not going to ask you to leave," Mrs. Whitmore said, after a moment of comfortable silence. "Libraries are meant to be refuges after all, and you clearly have need of refuge tonight. But I am concerned about your welfare, and I would very much like to understand how I might help you." The word help hit Harry like a physical blow. In his experience, adults who claimed they wanted to help were usually the most dangerous of all. They were the ones who spoke in soothing tones while arranging punishments, who promised protection while ensuring vulnerability, who used kindness as a weapon more devastating than any physical cruelty. But something about Mrs. Whitmore felt different. Perhaps it was the way she had positioned herself at his level, or the genuine concern in her voice, or the simple fact that she had not immediately demanded explanations or threatened consequences. For the first time in his life, Harry found himself wondering if there might be adults in the world who actually meant what they said. "I cannot go home," Harry whispered finally, the words emerging from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. They were the first words he had spoken aloud since discovering the contract, and they seemed to hang in the air between them like a confession of the deepest possible sin. Mrs. Whitmore nodded slowly, as though this was exactly what she had expected to hear. "I see," she said, and something in her tone suggested that she truly did see, that she understood the weight of what Harry was not saying as clearly as what he was. "May I ask why you cannot go home?" Harry's grip on the contract tightened instinctively. How could he possibly explain what he had discovered without sounding completely insane? How could he tell this kind stranger that the most respected wizard in Britain had paid his relatives to abuse him? How could he expect anyone to believe such an impossible story? But as he looked into Mrs. Whitmore's patient eyes, Harry realized that the impossibility of his situation had already moved far beyond normal boundaries. He was sitting in a library in the middle of the night, clutching evidence of a conspiracy that involved magic and money and the systematic torture of children. Normal explanations were no longer adequate for the reality he found himself inhabiting. "I found something," Harry said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something that changes everything." Mrs. Whitmore leaned forward slightly, her attention focused entirely on Harry in a way that made him feel simultaneously vulnerable and valued. "What did you find?" she asked gently. For a long moment, Harry struggled with the decision. Revealing the contract would mean trusting this stranger with secrets that could reshape his entire world. But keeping it hidden would mean facing the Dursleys alone, armed with terrible knowledge, but no allies to help him use it effectively. Finally, with hands that shook so badly he could barely maintain his grip, Harry held out the rolled parchment toward Mrs. Whitmore. She accepted it with the same careful reverence he had shown when first discovering it, unrolling the document with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to handling delicate materials. The silence that followed stretched on for what felt like hours as Mrs. Whitmore read through the contract with meticulous attention to detail. Harry watched her face as she progressed through the document, noting the way her expression shifted from puzzlement to concern to something that might have been carefully controlled rage. When she finally looked up, her eyes held a quality that Harry had never seen directed toward him before: righteous indignation on his behalf. "This is monstrous," she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that was far more frightening than Vernon's explosive anger. "Absolutely monstrous." Harry felt something inside his chest that might have been relief or vindication, or simply the overwhelming gratitude of being believed. "You can see it too," he whispered. "You can see what it says." "I can indeed," Mrs. Whitmore replied, her tone grim. "And I can tell you with absolute certainty that what is described in this document represents multiple violations of both statutory law and basic human decency. No child should ever be subjected to such treatment, regardless of the circumstances that led to their placement." She rolled the contract back up carefully and held it out to Harry, who accepted it with the same reverence he had shown throughout the night. But Mrs. Whitmore was not finished speaking, and what she said next would change everything that followed. "I should also tell you," she continued, her voice taking on a different quality that Harry could not immediately identify, "that I am not entirely unfamiliar with documents of this type. You see, I am what your world would call a squib, someone born into a magical family, but lacking magical ability myself. I have seen enough genuine magical documents over the years to recognize the specific characteristics that mark them as authentic rather than elaborate forgeries." Harry's world tilted sideways for the second time in as many hours. The revelation that Mrs. Whitmore had connections to the magical world felt simultaneously impossible and inevitable, as though the universe was conspiring to provide him with exactly the resources he needed at precisely the moment he needed them most. "This document is genuine," Mrs. Whitmore continued, her tone taking on the professional authority of someone delivering an expert opinion. "The seals, the parchment, the magical signatures, all of it bears the characteristics of official ministry correspondence, which means that everything described within it has the weight of legal authority behind it." Harry felt tears he had not realized were forming begin to spill down his cheeks. For years he had wondered if there was something fundamentally wrong with him, something that justified the treatment he received from the only family he had ever known. The contract had revealed that his suffering was not the result of his own failings, but it had also shown him how thoroughly he had been betrayed by those who should have protected him. "What am I supposed to do?" he whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of his helplessness. "Who would believe me? Who would care enough to help?" Mrs. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful as she considered the magnitude of what they were facing. When she finally spoke, her words carried the decisive quality of someone who had reached an important conclusion. "I have a nephew," she said slowly. "His name is James Whitmore, and he is a solicitor who specializes in child welfare cases. He has spent his entire career fighting for children who have been failed by the systems meant to protect them, and he has never lost a case involving documented abuse." She paused, studying Harry's face carefully before continuing. "More importantly, he is someone I trust completely, someone who would see this document for what it truly is, and who would have the knowledge and resources necessary to ensure that justice is done." Harry felt something that might have been hope beginning to stir in his chest, fragile and dangerous, but undeniably real. "But what if they try to stop him?" he asked. "What if the people who made this agreement have ways of making sure no one believes the truth?" Mrs. Whitmore's smile was fierce and determined, the expression of someone who had faced difficult battles before and emerged victorious. "My dear boy," she said, her voice carrying absolute conviction, "you have just provided us with documentary evidence of crimes that would shock even those accustomed to dealing with the worst aspects of child welfare. The people responsible for this agreement may have significant power within their own community, but they have made the critical mistake of putting their crimes in writing. She reached out and gently touched Harry's shoulder, the first kind physical contact he could remember receiving in years. And more importantly, she continued, they have underestimated the power of people who care more about justice than politics. My nephew has built his entire career on the principle that no child should suffer while adults argue about jurisdictions and procedures. For the first time since discovering the contract, Harry allowed himself to believe that his terrible knowledge might actually become the key to changing his circumstances, rather than simply making them worse. The idea that there were adults in the world who would fight for him, who would see the document as evidence rather than excuse, felt almost too good to be true. But Mrs. Whitmore was already moving forward with the practical details of what would come next. We need to keep you safe, while James reviews the document and determines our best course of action, she said, her tone taking on the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to solving complex problems. The library has a small apartment on the second floor where I sometimes stay when working late on major projects. You can rest there tonight, and in the morning we will contact James and begin the process of ensuring that justice is finally served. Harry nodded, overwhelmed by the kindness and competence that Mrs. Whitmore was showing him. For years he had dreamed of finding someone who would see his situation clearly and care enough to help him change it. The fact that such a person had appeared at his moment of greatest need felt like the kind of miracle he had stopped believing in long ago. As Mrs. Whitmore led him through the darkened library toward the stairs that would take them to temporary safety, Harry clutched the contract against his chest with renewed purpose. What had begun as evidence of the ultimate betrayal was transforming into something far more powerful, proof that the system that had failed him so completely could be held accountable for its crimes. The night that had started with discovery and terror was ending with something Harry had almost forgotten existed: hope. And for the first time in his life, he began to believe that the terrible knowledge he now possessed might actually become the foundation for building a future worth living. Behind them, the library settled back into its peaceful silence, its books standing ready to offer sanctuary to anyone brave enough to seek knowledge, no matter how dangerous that knowledge might prove to be. And somewhere in the darkness of Little Whinging, the Dursleys continued their frantic search for a boy who had finally found the courage to stop running toward safety and start running toward justice instead. The transformation had begun, and there would be no going back. The morning light filtering through the library apartment's small window carried with it the promise of answers that Harry had never dared hope for. He had spent the night in the first truly safe space he could remember, wrapped in blankets that smelled of lavender and old books rather than fear and desperation. Mrs. Whitmore had provided him with clean clothes that actually fit, simple but well-made garments that felt foreign against skin accustomed to threadbare hand-me-downs that hung like sackcloth on his undernourished frame. But more than the physical comfort was the revolutionary experience of being in a space where his presence was welcomed rather than merely tolerated. Mrs. Whitmore had prepared a simple breakfast of toast and jam with tea that she served in proper china rather than chipped plastic, treating him like a guest rather than an unwanted burden. The normalcy of it was almost overwhelming, this glimpse into how other children might experience the simple routine of morning meals. Harry sat at the small table that dominated the apartment's main room, the contract spread before him like a map to territories he was only beginning to understand. In the clear light of day, the document seemed even more damning than it had in the library's shadows. Every clause revealed new layers of calculated cruelty, each euphemism translating into memories of specific humiliations and torments that he now understood had been prescribed rather than spontaneous. Mrs. Whitmore moved about the small kitchen with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to making the most of limited space, but Harry could sense her frequent glances in his direction. She was worried about him, he realized, not in the calculating way that adults usually monitored his behavior for signs of trouble, but with genuine concern for his well-being. It was another first in his experience, this feeling of being cared for rather than simply managed. "James should be here within the hour," Mrs. Whitmore said, as she settled into the chair across from Harry with her own cup of tea. "I called him very early this morning and explained that we had a situation requiring his immediate attention. He asked very few questions, which tells me he understands the gravity of what we are dealing with." Harry nodded, though his stomach clenched with familiar anxiety at the prospect of meeting another adult who would have power over his fate. 9 years of experience had taught him to be wary of anyone who claimed they wanted to help, particularly those who possessed the authority to make decisions that would affect his future. Mrs. Whitmore seemed to sense his apprehension because her next words addressed the fears he had not yet found the courage to voice. "James is nothing like the adults you have known," she said gently. "He became a solicitor specifically because he was failed by the system as a child himself. He understands what it means to be powerless in the face of adult authority, and he has dedicated his life to ensuring that other children do not suffer as he did." She paused to sip her tea, giving Harry time to process this information. "More importantly," she continued, "he has extensive experience dealing with cases that involve multiple jurisdictions and unusual circumstances. If anyone can navigate the complexities of challenging both magical and mundane authorities simultaneously, it is James." The sound of footsteps on the library's main stairs interrupted their conversation, followed by a gentle knock on the apartment door. Mrs. Whitmore rose to answer it, and Harry heard the soft murmur of voices as she spoke briefly with someone in the hallway. When she returned, she was accompanied by a man who looked to be in his early 30s, dressed in the kind of practical clothing that suggested competence rather than wealth. James Whitmore possessed the same intelligent eyes as his aunt, but where hers held the patient wisdom of someone who had spent decades nurturing young minds, his carried the focused intensity of someone accustomed to fighting battles where children's lives hung in the balance. He was not particularly tall or imposing, but there was something in his bearing that suggested he would not be easily intimidated or dismissed. "Harry," James said, settling himself at the table with the same careful attention to positioning that his aunt had shown the night before. "Margaret has told me something of your situation, though I suspect there are details that can only come from you directly. Before we begin, I want you to understand that everything we discuss is protected by solicitor-client privilege, which means that no one can compel me to reveal what you tell me without your explicit consent." Harry nodded, though the legal terminology felt foreign and overwhelming. He had no experience with concepts like privilege or protection, having lived his entire life in a world where his words could be twisted against him at any moment. James seemed to understand his confusion, because he continued in a tone that was both professional and reassuring. "What that means in practical terms is that you can tell me the truth, the whole truth, without fear that it will be used to hurt you. My job is to protect your interests and ensure that your rights are respected. Nothing more and nothing less." The concept was so foreign to Harry's experience that it took several moments for its implications to sink in. An adult whose job was to protect him rather than control him, who would fight for his interests rather than their own. It seemed almost too good to be true, but Mrs. Whitmore's presence and obvious trust in her nephew provided a foundation of credibility that Harry found himself unable to dismiss. "I found this yesterday," Harry said finally, pushing the contract across the table toward James. "I was cleaning my uncle's study and discovered it hidden under a loose floorboard." James accepted the document with the same careful reverence that both Harry and Mrs. Whitmore had shown, but his examination was far more thorough and methodical. He read through it twice, making occasional notes in a small leather journal, before setting it aside and focusing his full attention on Harry. "This document describes systematic abuse disguised as legitimate guardianship," James said, his voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who had seen too many similar cases. The language is carefully crafted to provide legal cover for the perpetrators, but the reality it describes constitutes criminal conduct under both child protection statutes and basic human rights legislation. He paused, studying Harry's face with the penetrating gaze of someone trained to read the subtle signs of trauma and abuse. But before we proceed with any legal action, I need to understand the full extent of what has been done to you. I know this will be difficult, but I need you to tell me about your experiences with the Dursleys in as much detail as you can manage. The next hour was simultaneously the most difficult and most liberating of Harry's life. For the first time, he found himself speaking openly about experiences he had never been allowed to acknowledge, describing years of systematic cruelty in words that carried the weight of legal significance rather than the helpless desperation of unheeded complaints. James listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that every detail mattered, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but never interrupting the flow of Harry's narrative. He took extensive notes, not just of the events themselves, but of their psychological impact and the systematic way they had been employed to break Harry's spirit and ensure his compliance. When Harry described the cupboard under the stairs where he had slept for the first 11 years of his life, James's pen stilled for a moment before continuing with deliberate precision. When he recounted the systematic starvation disguised as discipline, the solicitor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. But when Harry detailed the way his magical incidents had been punished with increasing severity, James set down his pen entirely. "Harry," James said, his voice carrying a quality that Harry had never heard directed toward him before. "What you have described constitutes not just abuse, but torture. Systematic, calculated torture designed to break your will and ensure your compliance with whatever plans had been made for your future." The word torture hit Harry like a physical blow. He had always known that his treatment was wrong, but he had lacked the vocabulary to name it properly. Hearing it described in such stark terms by someone with the authority to make such judgments felt simultaneously validating and terrifying. But James was not finished. More importantly, he continued, "The document you discovered provides incontrovertible evidence that this torture was not only condoned, but actively funded by the highest levels of magical authority. This transforms what might have been seen as a tragic case of kinship care gone wrong into a criminal conspiracy involving multiple parties and jurisdictions." Mrs. Whitmore had been silent throughout Harry's recitation, but now she spoke with the controlled fury that had marked her initial reaction to the contract. "What are our options, James? What can we do to ensure that Harry is protected and that those responsible are held accountable?" James was quiet for several moments, his expression thoughtful as he considered the complexities of the situation they were facing. "We have multiple avenues available to us," he said finally. "The criminal aspects fall under both magical and mundane law, while the civil implications could provide grounds for significant damages and systemic reform." He turned his attention back to Harry, his expression serious but not unkind. "However, I need you to understand that pursuing this case will not be easy. The people responsible for your situation possess significant power and resources, and they will not surrender without a fight. You will be asked to testify repeatedly, to relive these experiences in formal settings, and to withstand attempts to discredit both you and your account." Harry felt a familiar flutter of panic at the prospect of facing such challenges, but it was tempered by something he had never experienced before, the knowledge that he would not be facing them alone. "I want them to be held accountable," he said, his voice stronger than he had expected. "I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else." James smiled, the expression transforming his serious features and revealing the passion that drove his work. "In that case," he said, "we have a great deal of work to do. But first, we need to ensure your immediate safety and well-being." The remainder of the morning was spent establishing the practical foundations for the battle ahead. James made a series of phone calls to colleagues and contacts, speaking in the careful professional language that Harry was beginning to recognize as the way adults conducted important business. Mrs. Whitmore worked on documenting Harry's physical condition, photographing old scars and current injuries with the methodical precision of someone building an evidentiary record. The process was both embarrassing and empowering for Harry. Having adults treat his injuries as evidence, rather than shameful secrets, transformed them from sources of humiliation into proof of crimes that demanded justice. Each photograph represented another piece of the case that would ultimately hold his tormentors accountable for their actions. James had arranged for a medical examination with a doctor who specialized in documenting abuse, explaining that Harry's physical condition would provide crucial corroboration for the testimony he would eventually give. He had also initiated contact with Child Protective Services, though he warned that the unusual circumstances of the case would require careful navigation of bureaucratic procedures. But perhaps most importantly, he had begun the process of establishing secure communications and safe houses that would protect Harry from retaliation while the case developed. The apartment above the library was suitable for a few days, but longer-term security would require more sophisticated arrangements. As the afternoon progressed, Harry found himself experiencing emotions he had almost forgotten existed. There was still fear, of course, and the ever-present anxiety that had been his constant companion for 9 years. But beneath those familiar feelings was something entirely new, the sense that he had worth beyond his utility to others, that his suffering mattered to people who had no obligation to care about him. Mrs. Whitmore had prepared lunch with the same careful attention she had shown to breakfast, but this meal felt different. Instead of the tentative gratitude that had marked their earlier interaction, Harry found himself able to participate in conversation, to ask questions about the legal processes that would determine his future, to express opinions about decisions that would affect his life. The transformation was subtle, but profound. For the first time in his memory, Harry was being treated as a person rather than a problem, as someone whose thoughts and feelings mattered rather than obstacles to be overcome or managed. The experience was intoxicating in its novelty, but also terrifying in its implications for everything he had previously understood about his place in the world. James had spent much of the lunch break reviewing additional legal precedents and consulting with colleagues about the unique aspects of Harry's case. When he returned his attention to the present conversation, his expression carried the focused intensity of someone who had reached important conclusions about strategy and tactics. "We have several advantages that I did not fully appreciate this morning," he said, settling back into his chair with the satisfied air of someone who had solved a complex puzzle. "The document you found is not just evidence of criminal conduct. It is evidence of criminal conduct that violates both magical and mundane law simultaneously." He paused to organize his notes before continuing. "This means we can pursue parallel cases in multiple jurisdictions, making it much more difficult for the responsible parties to suppress or dismiss our claims. They may have significant influence within the magical community, but that influence does not extend to the mundane legal system, where child protection laws are both well-established and rigorously enforced." Mrs. Whitmore leaned forward with interest. "What does that mean in practical terms?" she asked. "It means," James replied with obvious satisfaction, "that we can force them to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously, stretching their resources and making coordinated resistance much more difficult. More importantly, it means that even if they manage to suppress the magical aspects of the case, they cannot prevent the mundane authorities from pursuing criminal charges based on the clear evidence of child abuse." Harry felt a surge of something that might have been hope or vindication, or simply the deep satisfaction of knowing that his tormentors would finally face consequences for their actions. But James was not finished outlining their advantages. Additionally, he continued, "The financial aspects of the conspiracy provide clear evidence of criminal intent and systematic planning. This is not a case where we have to prove malicious intent. The document itself establishes that the abuse was not just deliberate, but compensated. The implications of this observation began to sink in as James continued his analysis. The people responsible for your situation made the critical error of documenting their crimes in detail, he said. They created a paper trail that eliminates most of the ambiguity that usually complicates abuse cases. We do not have to rely solely on your testimony against their denials. We have their own words describing exactly what they intended to accomplish. As the afternoon wore on, Harry began to understand the full scope of the legal machinery that was being mobilized on his behalf. James had contacted colleagues who specialized in different aspects of the case, creating a network of professional advocates who would ensure that no element of the conspiracy escaped scrutiny. There would be criminal charges against the Dursleys for child abuse and fraud, civil lawsuits against the magical authorities who had funded and authorized the abuse, and regulatory complaints that could result in systemic reforms to prevent similar situations in the future. The case would be pursued simultaneously in multiple forums, making it impossible for any single authority to suppress or dismiss the entire matter. But perhaps most importantly, James had arranged for Harry's immediate removal from the Dursleys' custody through emergency protective orders that would prevent any retaliation while the case developed. Harry would be placed in specialized foster care with a family trained to work with children who had experienced systematic abuse, providing him with safety and stability while the legal processes unfolded. The concept of being placed with a family that actually wanted him, that had been trained to help him heal from his experiences, was so foreign to Harry's understanding that he struggled to process its implications. For 9 years, he had lived with the knowledge that he was unwanted and unwelcome, that his presence was tolerated only because of financial incentives. The idea that there were adults who chose to care for traumatized children out of genuine compassion rather than obligation seemed almost too good to be true. As evening approached, Harry found himself sitting quietly while James and Mrs. Whitmore finalized the arrangements that would determine his immediate future. The contract lay on the table between them, no longer a source of devastating revelation, but a weapon that would be used to destroy the system that had failed him so completely. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and uncertainties, formal interviews and medical examinations, and the beginning of legal processes that might take months or years to complete. But tonight, for the first time in his life, Harry Potter would go to sleep, knowing that he was valued and protected, that adults who cared about justice were working to ensure his safety and well-being. The transformation that had begun with a terrifying discovery in Vernon's study was accelerating beyond anything Harry could have imagined. What had started as evidence of the ultimate betrayal was becoming the foundation for not just personal liberation, but systematic change that would protect other children from suffering similar fates. As Mrs. Whitmore prepared another simple meal, and James continued his careful documentation of evidence and strategy, Harry allowed himself to believe that the terrible knowledge he possessed might actually become the key to building a future worth living. The contract had revealed the worst possible truth about his situation, but it had also provided him with something infinitely more valuable: proof that the system that had failed him so completely could be held accountable for its crimes, and Harry was determined to make sure that it was. The morning that would forever divide Harry Potter's life into before and after began with the sound of official vehicles pulling into the usually quiet streets of Little Whinging. From the library apartment window, Mrs. Whitmore watched as unmarked cars and social services vans assembled outside number 4 Privet Drive like pieces on a chessboard, each positioned with the precision that comes from careful planning and absolute authority. Harry stood beside her, still wearing the clothes she had provided him the day before, but somehow transformed by the knowledge that he was no longer facing his situation alone. The terrified child who had fled through the darkness, clutching stolen evidence, had been replaced by someone who understood his own worth and rights, someone who had learned that there were adults in the world willing to fight for justice rather than personal advantage. James had arrived early, bringing with him a team of specialists whose credentials read like a catalogue of expertise in child protection and abuse cases. There was Dr. Sarah Chen, a pediatrician who specialized in documenting the physical effects of systematic abuse. Detective Inspector Robert Hayes, whose experience with complex conspiracy cases had made him the natural choice for coordinating the criminal investigation. And most importantly, there was Amanda Foster, a child advocate whose job was to ensure that Harry's interests remained paramount throughout the legal proceedings that would follow. The magnitude of the operation that had been mobilized on Harry's behalf was both overwhelming and deeply moving. For 9 years, he had lived in a world where his suffering was invisible to those who might have helped him. Now, in the span of 2 days, that suffering had become the focus of professional attention from multiple agencies, each committed to ensuring that justice was finally served. James had spent the early morning hours coordinating with the various agencies, ensuring that their simultaneous arrival at Privet Drive would maximize impact while minimizing the opportunity for evidence to be destroyed or stories to be coordinated. The timing had been calculated to catch the Dursleys at their most vulnerable, when Vernon would be preparing for work and Aunt Petunia would be distracted by her morning routines. Through the library's borrowed binoculars, Harry could see the chaos that was erupting at his former prison. Vernon had emerged from the house in his dressing gown, his face purple with the kind of rage that Harry knew preceded his most violent episodes. But the child protection officers and police constables surrounding him seemed singularly unimpressed by his bluster, treating his protestations with the professional indifference reserved for subjects under investigation rather than concerned citizens deserving of explanation. Detective Inspector Hayes approached the front door with the measured confidence of someone who had executed similar operations countless times before. Even from a distance, Harry could see the contrast between his calm authority and Vernon's increasingly frantic gestures. This was not a conversation between equals, but an official interrogation conducted by representatives of systems that possessed far more power than Vernon had ever wielded. The moment that Vernon was presented with the search warrant seemed to crystallize everything that had changed in Harry's world. The man who had dominated every aspect of his existence for 9 years was suddenly reduced to helpless compliance, forced to step aside while uniformed officers entered his domain and began methodically documenting evidence of crimes that could no longer be hidden or dismissed. Aunt Petunia appeared in the doorway, her usual morning composure shattered by the invasion of official authority. Harry had never seen her look genuinely frightened before, not in the calculated way she used fear to control others, but with the authentic terror of someone who suddenly understood that consequences they had never imagined might be descending upon them. James had positioned himself at Harry's shoulder, providing quiet commentary on the proceedings unfolding below. "The search team knows exactly what they are looking for," he explained, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose careful preparation was bearing fruit. "We provided them with detailed information about the likely location of financial records, correspondence, and any other documents related to the custody arrangement." Harry watched as officers emerged from the house carrying boxes of evidence, each container representing another piece of the puzzle that would ultimately expose the full scope of the conspiracy. Vernon's study, the scene of Harry's world-changing discovery, was being systematically dismantled by professionals who understood the evidentiary value of every document and receipt. But it was the arrival of the third vehicle that transformed the morning from a criminal investigation into something far more significant. The sleek black car that pulled up behind the police vans bore no official markings, but James's sharp intake of breath told Harry that its occupants represented a level of authority that even the mundane officials would be compelled to acknowledge. Dumbledore himself emerged from the vehicle with the measured dignity that had made him a figure of respect throughout both the magical and mundane worlds. But there was something different about his bearing this morning, a tension that suggested he was facing a situation that could not be resolved through the careful manipulation and political maneuvering that had served him so well throughout his long career. He was accompanied by 2 other figures that Harry did not recognize, but whose expensive robes and obvious deference to Dumbledore suggested they were high-ranking ministry officials. The fact that the magical authorities had responded so quickly and with such senior representation told Harry everything he needed to know about how seriously they regarded the threat to their carefully constructed arrangements. James had anticipated this development, of course. His conversations with colleagues had made it clear that the magical authorities would attempt to contain the situation before it could escalate beyond their ability to control. But the solicitor had also prepared countermeasures that would ensure the investigation continued regardless of whatever pressure might be brought to bear. Detective Inspector Hayes approached the magical delegation with the professional courtesy due to foreign dignitaries, but his body language made it clear that he regarded them as subjects of investigation rather than allies in the pursuit of justice. The conversation that followed was too distant to be overheard, but the increasingly animated gestures from the ministry officials suggested that they were not receiving the cooperation they had expected. Harry felt a surge of fierce satisfaction as he watched Dumbledore's attempts at persuasion meet with polite but implacable resistance from the mundane authorities. For the first time in his life, he was witnessing the limits of the power that had shaped his existence, seeing the careful political arrangements that had enabled his suffering come into conflict with systems that operated according to different rules and priorities. Mrs. Whitmore had been silent during the early stages of the operation, but now she spoke with the controlled intensity that Harry had learned to recognize as her response to witnessing injustice. "They are trying to negotiate jurisdiction," she observed, her tone carrying years of frustration with similar bureaucratic maneuvering. "They want to handle this internally to keep it within magical channels where they can control the narrative and minimize consequences." But James had prepared for exactly this scenario. His phone buzzed with what Harry suspected was a prearranged signal, and the solicitor stepped away to take a call that would likely determine how the next phase of the confrontation would unfold. When he returned, his expression carried the grim satisfaction of someone whose strategic planning was proceeding exactly as intended. "The European Court of Human Rights has agreed to accept emergency jurisdiction," James announced, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would reshape the entire scope of the case. "As of this morning, Harry Potter is under the protection of international human rights law, which supersedes any local jurisdictional claims." The implications of this development began to sink in as James continued his explanation. What this means in practical terms is that the magical authorities no longer have the option of handling this matter internally. The case will be pursued under international law, with oversight from bodies that are not subject to magical political pressure. Harry watched as this information was conveyed to the officials assembled outside his former home, noting the way Dumbledore's carefully maintained composure flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself. The wizard who had orchestrated his suffering was finally facing the possibility of consequences that he could not manipulate or dismiss, and the experience was clearly unfamiliar and unwelcome. The morning continued to unfold with the precision of a carefully choreographed performance, each new development building upon the last to create an unstoppable momentum toward justice. Child protection officers had documented the cupboard where Harry had been forced to sleep, their photographs and measurements providing incontrovertible evidence of conditions that violated every standard of acceptable childcare. Dr. Chen had arrived to conduct Harry's medical examination, her gentle professionalism providing a stark contrast to the rough handling he had always received from anyone claiming authority over his physical well-being. The examination itself was thorough but respectful, documenting not just the obvious signs of abuse, but the more subtle indicators of chronic malnutrition and systematic neglect. The evidence of stunted growth, old fractures that had healed improperly, and scarring consistent with deliberate infliction of pain painted a picture that corroborated every aspect of Harry's testimony. More importantly, it provided objective medical documentation that would be difficult for even the most skilled defense attorney to dismiss or minimize. But perhaps most damaging of all was the discovery of Vernon's personal records, meticulously maintained files that documented every payment received from the magical authorities, along with detailed reports on the methods used to ensure Harry's compliance. The man's obsessive need for documentation had created a comprehensive record of crimes that eliminated any possibility of claiming ignorance or good intentions. James had been monitoring these developments through regular communication with the team at Privet Drive, his satisfaction growing with each new piece of evidence that emerged from the search. "They found everything," he reported to Harry and Mrs. Whitmore, his voice carrying the triumph of someone whose faith in systematic investigation had been vindicated. Financial records, correspondence, even photographs that Vernon apparently took to document the conditions as proof of compliance with the agreement. The afternoon brought new developments that expanded the scope of the investigation beyond anything Harry had initially imagined. Detective Inspector Hayes had discovered evidence suggesting that the arrangement with the Dursleys was not unique, that similar contracts existed for other magical children whose circumstances made them vulnerable to systematic exploitation. The implications of this revelation transformed Harry's individual case into the tip of a much larger iceberg, a systematic pattern of abuse that had been hidden within the bureaucratic machinery of magical child protection. Each new piece of evidence suggested that what had been done to Harry was not an aberration, but a deliberate policy, implemented and maintained by institutions that had betrayed their most fundamental obligations. Amanda Foster had spent the afternoon working with Harry to prepare him for the media attention that would inevitably follow once the scope of the case became public knowledge. Her approach was both practical and compassionate, helping him understand what to expect while ensuring that his privacy and well-being remained protected throughout the process. The strategy they developed was carefully designed to maximize the impact of Harry's testimony, while minimizing his exposure to the kind of hostile scrutiny that might re-traumatize someone who had already suffered so much. He would speak when he chose to speak, in forums of his own selecting, with advocates present to ensure that his rights were respected and his story was heard accurately. As evening approached, Harry found himself reflecting on the magnitude of the changes that had occurred in just 48 hours. The terrified child who had discovered the contract in Vernon's study had been transformed into the focal point of an international investigation. Someone whose courage in speaking truth had mobilized systems of justice that he had never known existed. But more than the external changes was the internal transformation that had occurred as Harry learned to see himself through the eyes of people who valued him rather than those who had sought to break him. For the first time in his life, he understood that his suffering had not been deserved, that the treatment he had received was not normal or acceptable, and that he possessed both the right and the power to demand better. The final development of the day came in the form of a press conference that James had arranged with selected journalists, carefully chosen for their expertise in covering child protection issues and their commitment to responsible reporting. The goal was to establish the facts of the case in the public record before the inevitable attempts at spin and damage control could take hold. Harry had chosen not to attend the press conference directly, but he watched it through the library's computer as James and Detective Inspector Hayes presented the basic facts of the case to a room full of reporters whose questions revealed their growing understanding of the story's significance. The revelation that the most respected wizard in Britain had been involved in the systematic abuse of the child he was supposed to protect sent shockwaves through both magical and mundane communities. The questions from the press were sharp and informed, reflecting the kind of investigative instinct that suggested this story would not be easily buried or dismissed. Reporters wanted to know about oversight mechanisms, about how such arrangements had been permitted to continue, about what safeguards existed to protect other vulnerable children. James answered each question with the careful precision of someone who understood that every word would be scrutinized for evidence of weakness or inconsistency. He provided facts without speculation, evidence without interpretation, allowing the documented reality of Harry's situation to speak for itself rather than relying on emotional appeals or inflammatory rhetoric. But perhaps most importantly, He made it clear that this was not simply a story about one child's suffering, but about systematic failures that demanded comprehensive reform. The case of Harry Potter had revealed cracks in foundations that everyone had assumed were solid, and those cracks would need to be addressed before trust in the system could be restored. As the press conference concluded, and the immediate media attention began to shift toward analysis and investigation, Harry found himself experiencing emotions that he could barely name. There was satisfaction at seeing his tormentors finally face consequences for their actions. There was relief at knowing that he would never again be helpless in the face of adult authority. But perhaps most importantly, there was a sense of purpose that came from understanding that his suffering might prevent others from enduring similar fates. The apartment above the library had become a temporary command center, filled with the quiet energy of people working toward a common goal. Mrs. Whitmore continued to provide practical support and emotional stability, ensuring that Harry remained grounded in the midst of the chaos swirling around him. James maintained his focus on the legal and procedural aspects of the case, coordinating with colleagues and agencies to ensure that every avenue of justice remained open and protected. But it was Amanda Foster who helped Harry understand the broader significance of what he had set in motion. "This is bigger than your individual case now," she explained, her voice carrying both the weight of responsibility and the excitement of someone who believed real change was possible. "You have given voice to children who had no voice, who were suffering in silence because they believed no one would listen or care." As Harry prepared for sleep in what would be his last night in the library apartment, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from desperate flight to purposeful advocacy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, formal interviews and legal proceedings, and the beginning of a process that would reshape not just his own life, but the systems that affected countless other children. The contract that had shattered his world with its revelations had become the foundation for building something better, something that would ensure no child would suffer as he had suffered. The terrifying discovery in Vernon's study had transformed into the most powerful weapon imaginable against the forces that had enabled and profited from his pain, and Harry Potter, no longer a victim, but an agent of change, settled into sleep knowing that justice was no longer a dream, but an inevitability whose time had finally come. The morning that would transform Harry Potter from an individual case into the symbol of a broader movement began with an unexpected knock at the library apartment door. James had arrived early, but he was not alone. The woman who accompanied him carried herself with the quiet authority that Harry had learned to associate with people who possessed real power rather than merely its trappings. Amelia Bones introduced herself with the kind of straightforward professionalism that immediately commanded respect. As head of the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, she explained, she had been conducting a parallel investigation into financial irregularities within ministry payment systems, when Harry's case had provided the missing pieces of a puzzle she had been working to solve for months. "The timing of our respective discoveries is not coincidental," she said, settling into the chair that Mrs. Whitmore offered with practiced ease. "For the past year, I have been tracking unusual expenditures from discretionary funds that appeared to have no proper oversight or accountability. Your contract represents the first concrete evidence of where those funds were actually going." Harry studied her face as she spoke, noting the careful way she chose her words and the professional composure that never quite concealed an underlying current of barely controlled anger. This was someone who took her responsibilities seriously, who had been personally offended by the discovery that her own department's resources had been used to fund systematic abuse. But Madame Bones was not the only unexpected ally to emerge from the magical community's response to the revelations. James had received contact from Kingsley Shacklebolt, a senior Auror whose reputation for integrity had made him one of the few ministry officials trusted by both sides of various political disputes. His message had been brief but significant. There were others within the magical government who had long suspected that something was fundamentally wrong with certain child protection arrangements. Kingsley arrived within the hour, bringing with him a collection of documents that painted a picture of systematic corruption extending far beyond Harry's individual case. Internal memos, budget allocations, and personnel decisions that had seemed routine at the time now revealed themselves as components of a carefully orchestrated conspiracy to maintain control over vulnerable magical children. "The scope of what they have discovered is staggering," James explained to Harry as they reviewed the new evidence. "What was done to you appears to be part of a broader pattern affecting dozens of magical children over the past 2 decades. Children who were placed in situations designed to break their spirits and ensure their compliance with whatever plans had been made for their futures." Harry felt a complex mixture of vindication and horror as the true magnitude of the conspiracy became clear. On one hand, the revelation that he was not alone, that others had suffered similar fates, provided a kind of validation that his experiences had not been unique or somehow deserved. But on the other hand, the knowledge that so many children had been systematically abused while the magical world celebrated the supposed wisdom and benevolence of their leaders was almost overwhelming. Mrs. Whitmore had been quietly observing the morning's developments, but now she spoke with the kind of focused determination that Harry had learned meant she was preparing to take action. "Margaret," she said, turning to address Amelia Bones directly, "I believe it is time for us to consider making this information available to those who specialize in bringing such matters to public attention." The suggestion hung in the air for a moment, before James nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful as he considered the implications. "We need to control the narrative," he agreed. "If we allow the Ministry to continue managing information flow, they will find ways to minimize the significance of what has been discovered and redirect attention away from the systematic nature of the problems." It was Kingsley who provided the solution they needed. "Xenophilius Lovegood," he said, his tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone discussing a potentially controversial ally. "The editor of the Quibbler has been seeking credible sources for stories about ministry corruption for years. More importantly, he has established a reputation for publishing information that other outlets refuse to cover, regardless of the political pressure brought to bear." The idea of involving the Quibbler initially seemed almost absurd to Harry. His limited exposure to the magical press had taught him that serious news came from serious publications, and the Quibbler's reputation for eccentric stories and unconventional theories hardly seemed like the appropriate venue for exposing crimes of such magnitude. But as Kingsley continued his explanation, the logic of the choice became clearer. The Quibbler operates outside the traditional political networks that allow the Ministry to pressure editors and control coverage, he pointed out. Xenophilius has never been subject to the kind of financial or political leverage that keeps other publications in line with official positions. More importantly, Amelia Bones added, "The Quibbler's readership includes many people who have long suspected that official explanations of various events were inadequate or deliberately misleading. They are predisposed to take seriously information that contradicts ministry narratives, particularly when that information is supported by solid documentation. The decision to approach Xenophilius Lovegood represented a calculated risk, but one that offered significant potential rewards. If they could present Harry's story in a forum that would treat it with appropriate seriousness while remaining independent of ministry influence, they could establish public awareness of the issues before their opponents had time to organize effective counter-arguments." James had spent the morning coordinating with his colleagues to ensure that any media engagement would be conducted with appropriate safeguards for Harry's privacy and well-being. The goal was not simply to generate publicity, but to create public pressure for systematic reform while protecting the vulnerable children who might be affected by the inevitable backlash. The strategy they developed was both comprehensive and carefully calibrated. Harry would participate in a detailed interview that would provide the full context of his experiences while maintaining focus on the broader implications for child protection policy. The interview would be accompanied by supporting documentation from the various investigations, creating a complete picture that would be difficult to dismiss or discredit. But perhaps most importantly, the story would be framed not as an attack on individuals, but as a call for institutional reform. The goal was to create momentum for positive change, rather than simply assigning blame for past failures, though accountability for those failures would certainly be part of the broader process. Xenophilius Lovegood arrived at the library that afternoon with an energy that seemed to fill the small apartment, despite his relatively modest physical presence. He was accompanied by his daughter Luna, a girl who appeared to be roughly Harry's own age, whose dreamy expression and unusual accessories initially seemed to confirm every stereotype about the Quibbler's unconventional approach to journalism. But Harry's initial impressions proved to be incomplete and somewhat unfair. Xenophilius approached the interview with the kind of methodical professionalism that would have impressed even the most conventional journalist, asking probing questions and carefully verifying facts while maintaining sensitivity to the emotional impact of the topics they were discussing. Luna, meanwhile, positioned herself quietly in a corner of the room where she could observe the proceedings without interfering, but Harry found himself increasingly aware of her presence. There was something about the way she listened, with complete attention, but without the kind of morbid fascination that might have been expected from someone her age hearing such disturbing stories. The interview itself lasted several hours, with Xenophilius carefully documenting not just the facts of Harry's experiences, but the broader context that made those experiences possible. He asked about oversight mechanisms, about the financial arrangements that had funded the abuse, about the institutional failures that had allowed such systematic cruelty to continue undetected and unaddressed. But he also asked about hope, about Harry's vision for how things could be different, about the changes that might prevent other children from suffering similar fates. These questions were perhaps the most difficult for Harry to answer, requiring him to move beyond simply describing what had been done to him toward articulating what he believed should be done differently. The process of giving voice to his hopes for systematic reform was both empowering and terrifying for Harry. For 9 years, his thoughts had been focused entirely on survival, on enduring each day and hoping that somehow things might improve without his having to take any action that might make them worse. Now suddenly he was being asked to imagine not just a better future for himself, but better futures for children he had never met, in situations he could only guess at. As the afternoon progressed, Harry found himself drawing on resources he had not known he possessed. The experiences that had seemed like nothing but sources of pain and humiliation revealed themselves to be sources of insight into what was needed to protect vulnerable children. His understanding of how systems could be manipulated to hide abuse became the foundation for recommendations about transparency and accountability. Luna had remained quietly attentive throughout the interview, but as her father began organizing his notes and preparing to leave, she approached Harry with the kind of direct simplicity that seemed to characterize everything about her interaction with the world. "You are very brave," she said, her voice carrying none of the condescension that Harry had learned to expect from adults who wanted to praise him for enduring things they could barely imagine. Not just for surviving what was done to you, but for being willing to speak about it so that others might be protected. The comment was both unexpected and deeply moving, coming as it did from someone who seemed to understand instinctively that courage was not the absence of fear, but action taken in spite of fear. Harry had not thought of himself as brave, had indeed spent most of his life feeling like a coward for his inability to fight back against his tormentors. But Luna's perspective suggested a different way of understanding his situation and his response to it. "Thank you," Harry replied, finding that the simple acknowledgement meant more to him than all the professional praise and official recognition he had received from the adults working on his case. Luna smiled in response, an expression that seemed to contain both sympathy for what he had endured and confidence in what he might accomplish. As the Lovegoods prepared to leave, Xenophilius made a commitment that would prove crucial to everything that followed. "The story will run in tomorrow's edition," he announced, his tone carrying the weight of a promise that would not be broken, regardless of whatever pressure might be brought to bear. More importantly, I am prepared to follow up with additional coverage as new developments emerge, ensuring that public attention remains focused on the need for systematic reform. The evening that followed was marked by a sense of anticipation that seemed to permeate the library apartment like electricity before a storm. Everyone understood that the publication of Harry's story would represent a point of no return, the moment when private tragedy became public cause and individual suffering became the foundation for collective action. James spent the evening coordinating with colleagues and contacts throughout both the magical and mundane legal systems, ensuring that they were prepared to respond to whatever developments might emerge from the increased public attention. Amelia Bones worked through a backlog of cases and files, identifying other situations that might benefit from the increased scrutiny that Harry's story was likely to generate. But perhaps most importantly, Mrs. Whitmore spent time helping Harry prepare for the emotional impact of becoming a public figure, someone whose private pain would become the subject of discussion and debate throughout both communities. The transition from victim to advocate was never easy, she explained, but it was necessary if the changes he hoped to see were ever to become reality. As Harry settled into sleep that night, he reflected on the extraordinary week that had transformed his understanding of himself and his place in the world. The terrified child who had fled Privet Drive, clutching evidence of betrayal, had become someone whose courage in speaking truth had mobilized systems of justice and accountability that he had never known existed. But more than the external changes was the internal transformation that had occurred as Harry learned to see his experiences not as sources of shame, but as sources of strength, not as evidence of his own inadequacy, but as proof of the inadequacy of the systems that had failed him. The knowledge that his suffering might prevent others from enduring similar fates had given his pain a purpose that transcended its immediate impact. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, as public attention focused on issues that had previously remained hidden in the shadows of bureaucratic discretion and political convenience. The comfortable assumptions that had allowed systematic abuse to continue, unquestioned, would be challenged by the simple expedient of bringing them into the light where they could be examined and judged by people who had not participated in creating or maintaining them. The morning would also bring contact from unexpected allies, people throughout both the magical and mundane communities who had been waiting for an opportunity to address problems they had long recognized but felt powerless to confront alone. Harry's courage in speaking out had given them not just permission, but obligation to add their voices to the call for reform. As sleep finally claimed him, Harry Potter understood that he was no longer simply fighting for his own freedom and safety, but for the principle that no child should suffer while adults argued about jurisdictions and procedures. The contract that had revealed the worst possible truth about his situation had become the foundation for building something better, something that would ensure no child would be sacrificed on the altar of political convenience or institutional self-interest. The transformation from victim to advocate was complete, and the real work of creating lasting change was about to begin. Tomorrow would bring the Quibbler's story to the attention of both communities, and with it would come the pressure for answers and accountability that had been so long in coming. Harry Potter, no longer alone and no longer powerless, prepared to face whatever challenges that attention might bring, secure in the knowledge that he was fighting not just for himself, but for every child who had ever suffered in silence, while the adults who should have protected them looked the other way. The morning that the Quibbler hit the newsstands throughout magical Britain, Harry Potter woke to discover that his private suffering had become the most discussed topic in both worlds. From the library apartment, he could see owls streaming across the sky in numbers that suggested the magical postal system was operating at capacity, delivering copies of Xenophilius Lovegood's carefully documented exposé to readers who had never before given serious consideration to the Quibbler's unconventional journalism. James arrived early, his expression grim as he carried an armload of both magical and mundane newspapers, whose headlines revealed the scope of the story's impact. The Daily Prophet had attempted to dismiss the revelations with a front-page editorial, questioning the reliability of sources who would cooperate with publications known for sensationalism, but their defensive tone suggested they understood the gravity of what had been exposed. More tellingly, the mundane press had picked up the story with the kind of investigative enthusiasm that suggested they recognized its significance for child protection issues that extended far beyond the magical community. The Guardian had run a lengthy analysis piece exploring the intersection between magical law and mundane child welfare statutes, while the Times had focused on the international implications of systematic abuse funded by government agencies. But it was the response from within the magical establishment that revealed just how deeply the revelations had shaken the foundations of institutional power. Mrs. Whitmore had been monitoring magical wireless broadcasts throughout the night, documenting the increasingly desperate attempts by ministry officials to control the narrative and minimize the significance of the documented evidence. "They are claiming this is a politically motivated attack designed to undermine confidence in magical institutions," she reported, her tone carrying the weary recognition of someone who had seen similar damage control efforts many times before. Dumbledore himself released a statement through his office at Hogwarts, expressing regret for any misunderstandings, while maintaining that all decisions were made with the child's best interests at heart. Harry felt a surge of anger at the careful phrasing that seemed designed to acknowledge concern without accepting responsibility. After 9 years of systematic abuse, having his suffering dismissed as a misunderstanding felt like another violation, another attempt to minimize and normalize experiences that should have shocked anyone with basic human decency. But the establishment's response was not uniformly defensive. Amelia Bones had used her position within the ministry to issue an official statement announcing a comprehensive review of all child protection arrangements administered through her department, promising full cooperation with both magical and mundane investigators. Her decision to break ranks with the official response sent shockwaves through the political establishment that had expected unified resistance to external scrutiny. More significantly, other ministry employees had begun coming forward with information about irregularities and questionable decisions they had observed but felt powerless to challenge. Kingsley Shacklebolt had spent the early morning coordinating with these potential witnesses, documenting their concerns and ensuring their protection from retaliation. The pattern that emerged from these additional testimonies painted a picture of systematic corruption extending far beyond Harry's individual case. Children had been placed in situations designed to break their spirits, their magical abilities suppressed or misdirected to serve political purposes rather than their own development and well-being. James had anticipated that the publication of Harry's story would provoke aggressive countermeasures from those whose interests were threatened by the revelations. The first of these materialized in the form of an official inquiry team that arrived at the library demanding access to Harry for questioning about the authenticity of the documents and the accuracy of his testimony. The team was led by Dolores Umbridge, whose reputation for bureaucratic ruthlessness made her the natural choice for conducting investigations designed to discredit rather than discover truth. She arrived with the kind of officious authority that Harry had learned to associate with adults who enjoyed wielding power over those who could not fight back. But the dynamic she encountered at the library was fundamentally different from what she had expected. James greeted her with the professional courtesy due to an official visitor, while making it clear that any interaction with Harry would be conducted according to strict legal protocols designed to protect his rights and interests. "Mr. Potter is represented by counsel," James explained, his tone carrying the quiet authority of someone who understood both the law and his client's position within it. "Any questions you wish to ask will be posed in the presence of his legal team, with full documentation of the proceedings and advance notice of the topics to be covered." Umbridge's expression revealed her frustration with encountering resistance from someone who clearly understood the legal landscape well enough to navigate it effectively. She had apparently expected to find a traumatized child who could be intimidated into recanting his testimony or admitting to fabrication of evidence. Instead, she found Harry surrounded by competent advocates who treated his welfare as their primary concern, and his testimony as credible evidence worthy of protection rather than something to be suppressed or discredited. The transformation from helpless victim to protected witness had fundamentally altered the power dynamics that she had expected to exploit. The questioning that followed was both revealing and frustrating for Umbridge's purposes. Harry answered her questions with the careful precision that James had taught him, providing factual information without allowing himself to be drawn into speculation or emotional responses that might be used to question his credibility. When Umbridge pressed him about his motives for making the allegations public, Harry's response carried the kind of moral clarity that was difficult to dismiss or attack. "I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else," he said simply. "Children should not suffer while adults argue about jurisdictions and procedures." The simplicity and sincerity of his response seemed to catch Umbridge off guard, perhaps because she had expected the kind of complex political motivation that would be easier to discredit. Instead, she found herself facing someone whose primary concern was preventing future suffering rather than seeking personal revenge or political advantage. But Umbridge was not the only representative of institutional power to seek control over Harry's narrative. Throughout the morning, a steady stream of officials, journalists, and self-appointed spokespersons arrived at the library, seeking access to the boy whose courage in speaking out had exposed problems they preferred to keep hidden. Each visitor was greeted with the same professional courtesy and the same firm boundaries that protected Harry's right to control his own story. James had established clear protocols that ensured no one could exploit Harry's youth or trauma to extract statements that might be used against his interests. The effect of this protection was both practical and symbolic. On a practical level, it prevented Harry from being manipulated or intimidated by those who sought to minimize the significance of his revelations. But symbolically, it demonstrated that vulnerable children could be protected from institutional pressure when competent advocates were willing to stand between them and those who sought to exploit their vulnerability. The afternoon brought news that the story's impact was extending far beyond Britain's magical community. International magical governments had begun expressing concern about British child protection practices, while mundane child welfare organisations were calling for joint investigations that would ensure comprehensive oversight of arrangements that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. Perhaps most significantly, the European Court of Human Rights had announced its intention to conduct a formal review of the case, with particular attention to the systematic nature of the violations and the institutional failures that had allowed them to continue undetected. The prospect of international scrutiny had sent panic through the highest levels of British magical government. Mrs. Whitmore had spent the day coordinating with colleagues throughout the international library system, documenting similar cases and patterns that suggested the problems exposed by Harry's story were not unique to Britain. Her networks of professional contacts had provided access to information that painted a disturbing picture of systematic abuse hidden within magical child protection systems throughout Europe. As the day progressed, Harry began to understand that his individual case had become the catalyst for examining much broader questions about power, accountability, and the protection of vulnerable children within magical society. The contract that had revealed his own suffering had opened a window into problems that affected potentially hundreds of children whose stories had never been heard or investigated. But perhaps most importantly, the response to his story had revealed that there were far more people willing to fight for justice than he had ever imagined possible. Teachers, social workers, government officials, and ordinary citizens had begun speaking out about problems they had observed but felt powerless to address alone. The evening brought a development that transformed Harry's understanding of his own situation and its broader significance. A group of Hogwarts professors, led by Professor McGonagall, arrived at the library to express their support for his courage in speaking out and to provide additional information about the institutional pressures that had prevented them from intervening earlier. Professor McGonagall's testimony was particularly damning, revealing years of suppressed concerns about Harry's placement and the systematic dismissal of reports that might have led to his protection. Her decision to break her silence represented a significant crack in the wall of institutional loyalty that had protected those responsible for the conspiracy. "I knew something was fundamentally wrong with the arrangement," she admitted, her voice carrying the weight of years of suppressed guilt and frustration. "But I was told repeatedly that the situation was being monitored by appropriate authorities and that my concerns were based on incomplete information." The revelation that even senior magical educators had been kept in the dark about the true nature of Harry's placement added another layer to the institutional failures that had enabled his abuse. It suggested a level of compartmentalization and secrecy that went far beyond what might have been justified by legitimate security concerns. As the professors shared their own experiences of being silenced or marginalized when they raised concerns about child welfare issues, Harry began to understand that the system that had failed him had also failed the adults who had tried to protect him. The conspiracy had succeeded not just by targeting vulnerable children, but by isolating and neutralizing potential advocates within the broader magical community. But the professors had not come only to confess their past failures. They had also come to pledge their support for the systematic reforms that Harry's courage had made possible. Professor McGonagall announced that the Hogwarts faculty had voted unanimously to support comprehensive changes to magical child protection policies, including mandatory reporting requirements and independent oversight mechanisms. The symbolic significance of this endorsement from one of the most respected institutions in magical education could not be overstated. It represented a fundamental shift in the professional consensus about child protection, transforming what had been seen as acceptable practice into recognized abuse that demanded immediate correction. As the evening continued, Harry found himself at the center of discussions about policy reforms and institutional changes that would have seemed impossible just a week before. His story had not just exposed past failures, but created momentum for future improvements that would protect children he would never meet from suffering he understood all too well. The transformation from victim to catalyst was complete, but Harry was beginning to understand that his role in the broader movement for reform was just beginning. The courage he had shown in speaking out had inspired others to find their own voices, creating a chorus of concern that could not be silenced or dismissed by those who preferred the comfortable secrecy of the old arrangements. James had spent the evening coordinating with international colleagues and agencies, laying the groundwork for comprehensive reforms that would extend far beyond the British magical community. The goal was not just to address the specific failures that had enabled Harry's abuse, but to create new standards and protections that would prevent similar systematic violations in the future. Mrs. Whitmore had been documenting the day's developments with the methodical precision that characterized her approach to all important matters, creating a record that would ensure the momentum for reform could not be lost or misdirected by those who sought to minimize the significance of what had been exposed. As Harry prepared for sleep in what he had come to think of as his sanctuary above the library, he reflected on the extraordinary day that had transformed his private suffering into a public cause. The terrified child who had discovered evidence of betrayal in Vernon's study had become someone whose courage in speaking truth had mobilized systems of justice and accountability throughout both magical and mundane communities. But perhaps most importantly, he had learned that speaking truth, no matter how painful or difficult, was the foundation upon which all meaningful change was built. The contract that had shattered his world with its revelations had become the cornerstone of efforts to build something better, something that would ensure no child would suffer in silence while adults argued about procedures and jurisdictions. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities as the momentum for reform continued to build. But tonight Harry Potter could rest, knowing that his suffering had not been meaningless, that his courage had given voice to children who had no voice, and hope to those who had given up believing that justice was possible. The battle for systematic reform was far from over, but the foundation for victory had been laid by a 9-year-old boy who had refused to accept that his suffering was normal or acceptable, who had found the courage to speak truth even when that truth threatened the most powerful institutions in his world. The transformation was irreversible, and there could be no going back to the comfortable silences that had enabled so much suffering for so long. The morning that would determine the ultimate direction of Harry Potter's fight for justice began with news that sent shockwaves through both the magical and mundane legal establishments. Cornelius Fudge, Minister for Magic, had requested an emergency meeting with James Whitmore and his team, ostensibly to discuss a resolution that would avoid the international embarrassment of prolonged legal proceedings. The request itself was significant beyond its surface implications. For the minister to personally involve himself in what had initially been dismissed as a minor child welfare matter demonstrated just how seriously the magical establishment now regarded the threat to their carefully constructed narratives. The comfortable assumption that internal problems could be managed internally had been shattered by the international attention that Harry's case had generated. James had spent the early morning hours consulting with colleagues and reviewing strategy before agreeing to the meeting. The location would be neutral ground, a conference room in the International Magical Cooperation Building that would provide appropriate security while preventing either side from claiming home field advantage. More importantly, the meeting would be fully documented and observed by representatives from multiple oversight bodies. Harry understood that he would not be directly participating in these high-level negotiations, but he also understood that their outcome would fundamentally determine his future and the futures of countless other vulnerable children. The prospect of the magical establishment attempting to negotiate away accountability for systematic abuse filled him with a familiar anxiety, but it was tempered by his growing confidence in the advocates who had committed themselves to protecting his interests. Mrs. Whitmore had arranged for him to spend the day with Luna Lovegood and her father, recognizing that he needed the company of peers rather than the constant presence of adults discussing legal strategies and political implications. The Lovegood home was unlike any place Harry had ever experienced, filled with the kind of comfortable chaos that suggested a family where curiosity and creativity were valued above conventional order. Luna approached their day together with the same dreamy directness that characterized all her interactions. But Harry was beginning to understand that her unconventional perspective often revealed truths that more conventional thinking missed entirely. As they walked through the gardens behind her home, she asked questions that forced him to examine his own motivations and expectations in ways that no adult had managed to achieve. "Do you think they will try to make this go away by giving you things?" she asked, her tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than cynical calculation. Important people often think that children can be bought with promises and presents, but you do not seem like someone who would be satisfied with personal compensation while other children continue to suffer. The observation was both perceptive and challenging, forcing Harry to articulate principles he had not fully examined even in his own mind. "I do not want them to give me things," he replied slowly, working through his thoughts as he spoke. "I want them to change the system, so that what happened to me cannot happen to anyone else." Luna nodded, as though this was exactly the response she had expected, but her next question revealed another layer of complexity that Harry had not fully considered. "But what if changing the system requires you to become someone different than who you are now?" she asked. "What if fighting for justice means giving up the possibility of a normal childhood and accepting that you will always be known primarily for the terrible things that were done to you?" The question hit Harry like a physical blow, articulating fears he had not been willing to acknowledge even to himself. Since discovering the contract in Vernon's study, his life had been consumed by legal proceedings and media attention and the constant pressure of being a symbol for causes larger than his individual experience. The simple pleasures that other children took for granted had become impossible luxuries in a life dedicated to systematic reform. But as he considered Luna's question more deeply, Harry realized that the choice she was describing was not really a choice at all. The terrible things that had been done to him could not be undone by silence or secrecy. The only real choice was between suffering that served no purpose and suffering that might prevent others from enduring similar fates. "I was never going to have a normal childhood anyway," he said finally, his voice carrying the hard-won wisdom of someone who had learned to see his situation clearly. "The people who controlled my life made sure of that. At least now, I have the chance to make my suffering mean something." Luna smiled with the kind of quiet approval that suggested she understood both the difficulty and the necessity of the conclusion he had reached. "That is very brave," she said simply. "Not everyone would be able to see it that way, but I think you are exactly the person this situation needed." Meanwhile, the meeting between Fudge and James was unfolding with the careful formality that characterized high-stakes negotiations, where every word would be scrutinized for evidence of weakness or concession. Fudge had arrived with a full delegation, including legal counsel, public relations specialists, and senior ministry officials, whose presence was designed to demonstrate the seriousness with which the magical government regarded the situation. But James had anticipated this show of force and had assembled his own team of experts whose credentials in child protection law and international human rights made them more than capable of matching the ministry's legal firepower. More importantly, he had ensured that representatives from multiple oversight bodies were present to observe the proceedings and ensure that any agreements reached would be subject to appropriate scrutiny. The minister opened the meeting with the kind of carefully crafted statement that revealed the hand of professional speechwriters and public relations consultants. He expressed regret for any suffering that had occurred, while maintaining that all decisions had been made in good faith based on the best available information at the time. The magical government was committed to learning from this unfortunate situation and implementing reforms that would prevent similar misunderstandings in the future. James's response was both pointed and professional, cutting through the euphemisms and careful phrasing to address the documented reality of what had occurred. "Minister," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who understood both the law and the facts, "we are not discussing misunderstandings or good faith errors in judgment. We are discussing systematic abuse of a minor child, funded by government resources and authorized at the highest levels of magical authority." The documentation that supported this characterization was extensive and incontrovertible. Financial records showed regular payments to the Dursleys specifically for maintaining conditions that violated every standard of acceptable childcare. Correspondence revealed that ministry officials had been aware of Harry's suffering and had actively worked to prevent intervention by those who might have protected him. Perhaps most damaging of all were the reports filed by Mrs. Figg and other observers, documenting years of abuse that had been systematically ignored or suppressed by those responsible for Harry's welfare. The pattern that emerged was not one of oversight or miscommunication, but of deliberate policy implemented with full knowledge of its consequences. Fudge's team had prepared for this confrontation with evidence, but they had apparently underestimated both the extent of the documentation and the skill with which it would be presented. Their attempts to characterize the arrangement as a necessary security measure were systematically dismantled by James's methodical presentation of the facts. The meeting continued through the morning and into the afternoon, with each side testing the strength of the other's position while searching for areas where compromise might be possible. But the fundamental tension was between those who sought to minimize accountability for past failures and those who demanded comprehensive reform as the price of any resolution. It was Amelia Bones who ultimately broke the deadlock by presenting evidence that transformed the entire scope of the discussion. Her investigation had uncovered similar arrangements affecting dozens of other magical children, creating a pattern of systematic abuse that could not be dismissed as an isolated incident or well-intentioned mistake. The children affected ranged in age from toddlers to teenagers, but they all shared certain characteristics that had made them vulnerable to exploitation. Some were orphans like Harry, whose lack of family advocates made them easy targets for manipulation. Others came from families whose political views or magical abilities made them inconvenient for those in power. But regardless of their individual circumstances, they had all been placed in situations designed to break their spirits and ensure their compliance with whatever plans had been made for their futures. The systematic nature of the abuse made it impossible to characterize as anything other than a deliberate policy implemented at the highest levels of magical government. The revelation that Harry's case was part of a much larger pattern of abuse sent shockwaves through the meeting room and beyond. International observers who had initially viewed the situation as an unfortunate but isolated incident were forced to confront evidence of systematic violations that demanded comprehensive international intervention. Fudge's team attempted to maintain their defensive posture, but the scope of the evidence made their position increasingly untenable. The documentation provided by Amelia Bones painted a picture of institutional corruption that extended far beyond what could be explained by individual failures or bureaucratic incompetence. As the afternoon progressed, the dynamic of the meeting shifted fundamentally. What had begun as a negotiation between roughly equal parties had become something closer to a surrender discussion, with the magical establishment desperately seeking ways to limit the damage from revelations that threatened the foundations of their authority. James recognized the shift and pressed his advantage with the calculated precision of someone who understood that this might be their only opportunity to achieve meaningful systematic reform. The terms he presented were comprehensive and non-negotiable, designed to ensure that the failures that had enabled Harry's abuse could never be repeated. The demands included immediate removal of all children from questionable placements, establishment of independent oversight bodies with real authority to investigate and intervene, mandatory reporting requirements that could not be waived for political convenience, and compensation for all victims of the systematic abuse that had been documented. But perhaps most importantly, James demanded complete transparency about the scope of the conspiracy and full cooperation with international investigations that would ensure appropriate accountability for those responsible. The days of managing problems internally while hiding them from external scrutiny were over. The meeting concluded without formal resolution, but the trajectory of future negotiations had been established. The magical establishment would either accept comprehensive reform voluntarily or face the prospect of having change imposed upon them by international authorities who had no interest in protecting political reputations or institutional convenience. As Harry learned about the day's developments from James that evening, he felt a complex mixture of vindication and overwhelming responsibility. The courage he had shown in speaking out had not only exposed his own abuse, but had revealed systematic failures affecting dozens of other children who had suffered in silence, while adults argued about procedures and jurisdictions. The transformation from individual victim to catalyst for systematic reform was complete, but Harry was beginning to understand that his role in the broader movement was far from finished. The evidence of widespread abuse had created momentum for change that extended far beyond his personal situation, but sustaining that momentum would require continued courage and commitment from everyone involved. Mrs. Whitmore had spent the day coordinating with international colleagues and advocacy organizations, documenting similar patterns in other magical communities, and building support for reforms that would protect vulnerable children throughout the magical world. The response had been overwhelmingly positive, with child protection experts from multiple countries expressing willingness to support comprehensive changes to magical child welfare systems. Luna had provided exactly the kind of perspective and companionship that Harry had needed during such a crucial day, helping him maintain focus on the principles that drove his commitment to reform, while avoiding the kind of overwhelming pressure that might have undermined his resolve. Her friendship had become a source of stability that helped him navigate the complexities of being both a child and a symbol for systematic change. As Harry prepared for sleep that night, He reflected on how fundamentally his world had changed since that terrifying morning when he had discovered the contract in Vernon's study. The helpless victim, who had fled into the darkness, clutching evidence of betrayal, had become someone whose courage in speaking truth had mobilized international systems of justice and accountability. But perhaps most importantly, he had learned that individual courage, properly supported and strategically applied, could indeed change systems that seemed impossibly large and powerful. The contract that had revealed the worst possible truth about his situation had become the foundation for building protections that would benefit children he would never meet, in circumstances he could only imagine. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the momentum for reform continued to build. But Harry could rest, knowing that the battle for systematic change had reached a critical turning point. The magical establishment's attempts to minimize accountability and maintain control had been decisively rejected, creating space for the kind of comprehensive reform that might actually prevent future suffering. The pressure had reached its breaking point, and the foundations of the old system were finally beginning to crack under the weight of truth that could no longer be hidden or dismissed. Justice was no longer just a possibility, but an inevitability whose time had finally arrived. The morning that would forever change the magical world's understanding of its own institutions began with the simultaneous release of documents across 3 continents, coordinated by an international coalition of child protection agencies that had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Harry Potter watched from the library apartment as owls darkened the sky above Little Whinging, carrying copies of evidence that would shatter the comfortable assumptions upon which magical society had built its sense of moral authority. James had arrived before dawn, his expression carrying the grim satisfaction of someone whose meticulous preparation was about to bear devastating fruit. The coordinated release had been timed to prevent any single authority from suppressing the information before it could reach the public, with copies of the complete financial records simultaneously delivered to magical and mundane news outlets throughout Europe and North America. The scope of what they had uncovered was staggering in its systematic brutality. What had begun as an investigation into Harry's individual case had revealed a network of financial arrangements spanning decades, affecting not just dozens, but hundreds of magical children whose circumstances had made them vulnerable to exploitation by those who should have protected them. Mrs. Whitmore had spent the night coordinating with her international colleagues, ensuring that the evidence was presented with appropriate context and analysis that would help readers understand both its immediate significance and its broader implications for magical child protection systems. Her networks within the global library and academic communities had provided crucial support for documenting patterns that might otherwise have been dismissed as isolated incidents. The first edition of the Daily Prophet to hit the streets that morning carried a front-page story that represented a complete reversal of their previous defensive coverage. The newspaper's editorial board had been presented with evidence so comprehensive and damning that continued denial would have destroyed whatever credibility they retained with their readership. The headline read simply, "The Children We Failed, a Complete Investigation." But it was the international coverage that truly demonstrated the scope of the conspiracy that Harry's courage had exposed. The International Confederation of Wizards had released a statement expressing shock and dismay at the systematic nature of the violations, while magical governments throughout Europe announced their own investigations into similar arrangements within their jurisdictions. Perhaps most significantly, the magical governments of France, Germany, and Italy had jointly announced the establishment of an international oversight body with authority to investigate and intervene in cases where national magical authorities had failed to protect vulnerable children. The comfortable assumption that internal problems could be managed internally had been permanently shattered. Harry felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what his discovery had set in motion, but he also felt a deep sense of vindication that his suffering had not been meaningless. The contract hidden in Vernon's study had become the key that unlocked a comprehensive understanding of institutional failures that had enabled systematic abuse for generations. The evidence that had been released painted a picture of calculated cruelty that shocked even those who had long suspected that something was fundamentally wrong with magical child protection systems. Financial records showed that the arrangement with the Dursleys was just one of hundreds of similar contracts, each designed to ensure that vulnerable children could be controlled and manipulated without the inconvenience of genuine oversight or accountability. The children affected came from every segment of magical society, but they all shared certain characteristics that had made them targets for exploitation. Orphans, whose lack of family advocates made them easy to control. Children from families whose political views or magical abilities made them inconvenient for those in power. Young witches and wizards whose potential threatened established hierarchies or challenged comfortable assumptions about magical ability and social status. But regardless of their individual circumstances, they had all been systematically broken by arrangements designed to suppress their magical development, isolate them from potential allies, and ensure their compliance with whatever plans had been made for their futures. The scope of the betrayal was so comprehensive that it challenged fundamental assumptions about the moral authority of magical institutions. James had coordinated the release with surgical precision, ensuring that each revelation built upon the last to create an irrefutable pattern of systematic abuse. The financial records were accompanied by correspondence between ministry officials discussing the need to maintain control over potentially troublesome children. Personnel files revealed careers built on managing these arrangements, while ensuring that awkward questions were never asked or answered. Perhaps most damaging of all were Dumbledore's personal papers, obtained through legal discovery processes that had revealed the extent of his personal involvement in designing and maintaining the system of systematic abuse. His correspondence revealed a man who spoke publicly of protecting children while privately arranging for their systematic brutalization in service of what he characterized as the greater good. The letters painted a picture of calculated manipulation that extended far beyond Harry's individual case. Dumbledore had personally selected placement families based on their willingness to impose the kind of psychological and physical abuse that would break children's spirits while maintaining plausible deniability about the methods being employed. His justifications for these arrangements were chilling in their clinical detachment from the human cost of his decisions. Children who might have grown up to challenge established power structures were deliberately placed in situations designed to crush their confidence and suppress their magical development. Young witches and wizards whose potential threatened existing hierarchies were systematically broken before they could realize their abilities. But perhaps most revealing were his discussions of Harry's specific case, correspondence that showed he had been fully aware of the extent of the abuse being inflicted, while actively preventing intervention by those who might have protected him. The boy's suffering was not an unfortunate side effect of necessary security measures, but a deliberate strategy designed to ensure his compliance with plans that had been made without his knowledge or consent. The revelation that the wizarding world's most revered leader had personally orchestrated the systematic abuse of vulnerable children sent shockwaves through both magical and mundane communities. The comfortable assumption that institutional authority was exercised by those who possessed superior moral wisdom had been shattered by evidence of calculated cruelty implemented at the highest levels of magical government. Mrs. Whitmore had been monitoring international responses throughout the morning, documenting the growing calls for comprehensive reform that were emerging from magical communities around the world. The evidence of systematic abuse had created a crisis of confidence in magical institutions that could no longer be contained through traditional damage control measures. Child protection organizations that had long suspected problems with magical child welfare systems now had the documentation they needed to demand immediate intervention and systematic reform. International bodies that had previously deferred to national magical authorities on child protection, Pacer Matters were announcing their intention to impose direct oversight until appropriate safeguards could be established. But perhaps most significantly, other victims of the systematic abuse were beginning to come forward with their own stories, creating a chorus of testimony that corroborated every aspect of the documented evidence. Young adults who had survived placements designed to break their spirits were finding the courage to speak about experiences they had been taught to hide or minimize. The pattern that emerged from these testimonies was both heartbreaking and enraging. Children who should have been nurtured and protected had instead been systematically brutalized by arrangements that treated their welfare as secondary to political convenience and institutional control. The scope of the betrayal was so comprehensive that it challenged the fundamental legitimacy of the magical authorities who had enabled and maintained it. Luna had arrived at the library that morning with her characteristic, calm acceptance of extraordinary circumstances, but even she seemed moved by the magnitude of what Harry's courage had revealed. "You have given voice to so many children who had no voice," she observed, her tone carrying the kind of profound respect that Harry had rarely heard directed toward him. "That is perhaps the most important magic anyone could ever perform." The comment struck Harry with unexpected force, offering a perspective on his situation that transformed his understanding of what he had accomplished. For weeks, he had focused on the legal and procedural aspects of seeking justice for his own abuse. But Luna's observation helped him see that his real achievement lay in creating space for other victims to tell their stories and demand the protection they had always deserved. The afternoon brought news that the magical establishment's attempts to contain the crisis had failed completely. Minister Fudge had resigned in disgrace, unable to maintain his position in the face of evidence showing his personal involvement in covering up systematic abuse. His replacement had immediately announced a comprehensive review of all child protection arrangements and full cooperation with international oversight bodies. But perhaps most symbolically significant was the announcement from Hogwarts that Dumbledore had been removed from all positions of authority, pending a complete investigation into his role in the systematic abuse of magical children. The school's Board of Governors had voted unanimously to suspend him, citing their obligation to protect current and future students from any risk of similar treatment. The fall of the wizarding world's most revered figure sent shockwaves that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. If Albus Dumbledore, champion of light and defender of the innocent, could be revealed as the architect of systematic child abuse, then no assumption about moral authority or institutional wisdom could be taken for granted. James had spent the afternoon coordinating with international colleagues to ensure that the momentum for reform could not be dissipated by those who preferred gradual change to comprehensive transformation. The evidence that had been revealed demanded immediate action to protect children who remained at risk, followed by systematic reforms that would prevent similar abuses from occurring in the future. The scale of the changes being contemplated was unprecedented in the history of magical child protection. International oversight bodies would be established with authority to investigate and intervene regardless of national sovereignty concerns. Mandatory reporting requirements would be implemented with penalties severe enough to ensure compliance. Independent advocacy systems would be created to ensure that vulnerable children had access to protection and support. But perhaps most importantly, the entire philosophy underlying magical child protection would be fundamentally restructured. The comfortable assumption that institutional authorities knew what was best for children would be replaced by systems that prioritized children's own voices and experiences in determining their welfare and safety. As evening approached, Harry found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought him from terrified victim to catalyst for systematic reform. The contract that had shattered his world with its revelations had become the foundation for protections that would benefit children throughout the magical world, many of whom would never know his name, but would live safer lives because of his courage in speaking out. The transformation was both deeply personal and profoundly political, demonstrating how individual courage could indeed change systems that seemed impossibly large and entrenched. But Harry was beginning to understand that the real victory lay not in the punishment of those who had abused their authority, but in the creation of safeguards that would prevent future suffering. Mrs. Whitmore had prepared a simple dinner with the same careful attention she had shown throughout Harry's stay at the library. But tonight felt different somehow. The quiet apartment that had served as his sanctuary was filled with the energy of people who understood that they had witnessed something unprecedented, a moment when entrenched power had been forced to yield to documented truth and moral clarity. The conversation that accompanied their meal was both celebratory and sobering, acknowledging the magnitude of what had been accomplished while recognizing the enormous work that remained to be done. Exposing the scope of systematic abuse was only the first step in a process that would require sustained effort and vigilance to ensure that real protections were implemented and maintained. James had already begun coordinating with the International Coalition of Child Protection Agencies to develop comprehensive reform proposals that would transform magical child welfare systems throughout Europe and beyond. The goal was not simply to address the specific failures that had enabled Harry's abuse, but to create new standards and protections that would prevent similar systematic violations anywhere in the magical world. Luna had remained characteristically thoughtful throughout the discussion of future plans and possibilities, but as the evening drew to a close, she offered an observation that captured something essential about what Harry had accomplished. "The most important thing you have done is show other children that they are not alone," she said quietly, "that their suffering matters to people who have the power to help them, and that speaking truth can indeed change the world." As Harry prepared for sleep in what would be one of his final nights at the library apartment, he felt a complex mixture of exhaustion, relief, and cautious optimism about the future. The terrified child who had fled Privet Drive, clutching evidence of betrayal, had become someone whose courage had mobilized international systems of justice and protection that would benefit countless children he would never meet. But perhaps most importantly, he had learned that systematic change was possible when enough people were willing to confront uncomfortable truths and demand better from the institutions that shaped their lives. The contract that had revealed the worst possible truth about his situation had become the catalyst for building something infinitely better, something that would ensure no child would suffer in silence while adults argued about procedures and convenience. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities as the work of implementing comprehensive reforms began in earnest. But tonight, Harry Potter could rest knowing that his suffering had meaning, that his courage had given voice to the voiceless, and hope to those who had given up believing that justice was possible. The truth had been unveiled in all its devastating completeness, and there could be no going back to the comfortable silences that had enabled so much suffering for so long. The foundations of a better system were finally being laid, built on the bedrock of individual courage and sustained by the commitment of people who believed that protecting children was more important than protecting institutions. The transformation of magical child protection was no longer a possibility, but a reality whose implementation would define the moral character of the wizarding world for generations to come. The morning that justice finally materialized from years of patient legal work began with the sound of official owls arriving at addresses throughout magical Britain, carrying formal notices that would reshape the power structure of the wizarding world. Harry Potter watched from the window of his new temporary residence as the systematic dismantling of the conspiracy that had shaped his childhood moved from revelation to concrete consequences. The safe house that James had arranged was nothing like the sterile institutional settings Harry had feared when the topic of protective custody first arose. Instead, it was a comfortable family home, where he was welcomed not as a case to be managed, but as a child who deserved safety, stability, and the kind of ordinary kindness that had been absent from his life for so long. Margaret and Thomas Henderson were experienced foster carers who specialized in working with children who had survived systematic trauma. Their approach was both professional and genuinely caring, creating an environment where Harry could begin to heal while remaining engaged with the legal processes that continued to unfold around his case. The formal charges that had been filed overnight represented the culmination of months of careful investigation and legal preparation. Vernon and Petunia Dursley faced criminal prosecution for child abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges that could result in lengthy prison sentences. But their legal troubles were minor compared to the institutional reckoning that was simultaneously taking place throughout the magical government. James arrived early with news that sent shockwaves through both legal communities. The International Criminal Court had agreed to accept jurisdiction over the systematic abuse case, recognizing it as a crime against humanity that transcended national boundaries. The decision meant that those responsible would face justice under international law, with penalties that reflected the scope and systematic nature of their crimes. More immediately significant was the announcement that emergency protective orders had been issued for every child identified as being at risk under arrangements similar to Harry's placement with the Dursleys. Specialized teams of child protection officers were simultaneously removing vulnerable children from situations that had been disguised as legitimate care, but were actually designed to break their spirits and ensure their compliance. The operation was being conducted with the kind of precision and coordination that demonstrated just how seriously the international community now regarded the threat to magical children's welfare. Each removal was carefully planned and executed by teams that included not just child protection officers, but medical professionals, trauma counselors, and legal advocates who could ensure that the children's rights and interests were protected throughout the process. Mrs. Whitmore had spent the early morning coordinating with her international colleagues to document the scope of the operation and ensure that appropriate support services were available for the children being removed from abusive situations. The library networks that had provided crucial support during Harry's case were now being mobilized to create temporary safe spaces and resource centers throughout the magical world. The response from the children themselves was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Many had been so thoroughly conditioned to accept abuse as normal that they initially resisted efforts to remove them from familiar situations, even when those situations involved systematic cruelty. But others recognized the rescue for what it was and responded with the kind of desperate gratitude that came from finally being seen and protected by adults who cared about their welfare. Harry felt a complex mixture of emotions as he learned about each child who was being removed from circumstances similar to his own. There was satisfaction in knowing that his courage in speaking out had directly resulted in their protection, but there was also overwhelming sadness at the realization of just how many children had suffered in silence while the magical world celebrated its supposed moral authority. The institutional consequences were equally dramatic. Dumbledore's removal from Hogwarts had been followed by his expulsion from the International Confederation of Wizards, the loss of his Order of Merlin, and formal charges that could result in life imprisonment. The man who had been revered as the greatest wizard of his generation was facing the prospect of spending his remaining wars in Azkaban for crimes against the children he had claimed to protect. But Dumbledore was not the only high-profile figure facing serious consequences for their role in the conspiracy. Ministry officials throughout the child welfare bureaucracy had been arrested or suspended pending investigation. The entire Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, which had administered many of the abusive placements, was being disbanded and restructured under international oversight. Perhaps most symbolically significant was the fate of Cornelius Fudge, whose resignation in disgrace had been followed by criminal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and abuse of office. His trial was being conducted under international jurisdiction, ensuring that the comfortable political networks that had protected him throughout his career could no longer shield him from the consequences of his actions. The new Minister for Magic, Kingsley Shacklebolt, had been selected specifically for his record of integrity and his commitment to comprehensive reform. His first official act had been to establish a new Department of Child Protection and Advocacy, staffed by professionals who had been selected for their expertise and independence rather than their political connections. The department's mandate was both broad and specific, to ensure that no magical child would ever again suffer the kind of systematic abuse that had been hidden within the old bureaucratic structures. Every placement decision would be subject to independent review, every report of concern would be investigated by trained professionals, and every child would have access to advocates who were accountable to international oversight bodies rather than local political authorities. James had spent the morning reviewing the new legal frameworks that were being implemented to prevent similar abuses in the future. The reforms were comprehensive, addressing not just the specific failures that had enabled Harry's abuse, but the broader structural problems that had made such systematic cruelty possible. Mandatory reporting requirements had been strengthened and expanded, with severe penalties for officials who failed to act on credible reports of abuse. Independent oversight bodies had been established with real authority to investigate, intervene, and impose consequences when child protection systems failed. International monitoring systems would ensure that reforms were actually implemented rather than simply announced for public relations purposes. But perhaps most importantly, the entire philosophy underlying magical child protection had been fundamentally restructured. The comfortable assumption that institutional authorities knew what was best for children had been replaced by systems that prioritized children's own voices and experiences in determining their welfare and safety. The Henderson family had created an environment where Harry could experience this new approach firsthand. For the first time in his life, adults were asking him what he needed, rather than telling him what he should want. His preferences about food, clothing, activities, and education were treated as legitimate expressions of personal autonomy rather than inconvenient obstacles to efficient management. The contrast with his previous experiences was so stark that Harry sometimes felt overwhelmed by the simple kindness of being treated as a person whose thoughts and feelings mattered. Margaret Henderson had noticed his difficulty adjusting to normal family life, and had arranged for counseling with specialists who understood the complex trauma that resulted from systematic abuse. The therapy sessions were initially difficult for Harry, requiring him to revisit experiences he had spent years trying to forget or minimize. But gradually, he began to understand that healing was not about forgetting what had happened, but about integrating those experiences into a more complete understanding of himself and his place in the world. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the therapist who worked with Harry, helped him understand that his survival of systematic abuse was not evidence of weakness, but of extraordinary resilience. The coping mechanisms he had developed to endure years of cruelty were not character flaws, but adaptive responses to impossible circumstances. More importantly, she helped him understand that his decision to speak out about his experiences was not just personally courageous, but socially transformative. By refusing to accept that his suffering was normal or acceptable, he had created space for other victims to tell their stories and demand the protection they deserved. The afternoon brought news that demonstrated the international scope of the changes that Harry's case had set in motion. Magical governments throughout Europe had announced comprehensive reviews of their own child protection systems, with several countries discovering similar patterns of systematic abuse that had been hidden within their bureaucratic structures. The International Confederation of Wizards had established a permanent commission on child protection and advocacy, with authority to investigate suspected abuses and impose sanctions on governments that failed to protect vulnerable children. The commission's first chair was Amelia Bones, whose integrity and expertise had made her the natural choice for leading the comprehensive reform effort. Perhaps most significantly, the Commission had announced plans for an international registry of magical children, designed to ensure that no child could disappear into abusive placements without appropriate oversight and advocacy. The system would be administered by independent professionals who were accountable to international bodies rather than national political authorities. Luna had visited that afternoon, bringing with her the latest edition of the Quibbler, which featured a comprehensive analysis of the reforms being implemented throughout the magical world. Her father's coverage had been both detailed and accessible, helping ordinary families understand how the changes would affect their own communities and what they could do to support vulnerable children. The article included interviews with several of the children who had been removed from abusive placements, their stories providing powerful testimony to the importance of the reforms being implemented. Reading about their experiences helped Harry understand that his individual case was part of a much larger pattern of institutional failure that had affected hundreds of children over several decades. But perhaps more importantly, the article also featured interviews with magical families who were volunteering to provide foster care and adoption services for children who needed new placements. The response had been overwhelming, with far more families volunteering than could be immediately processed by the new child protection services. The outpouring of support suggested that the magical community was genuinely committed to ensuring that the failures of the past would not be repeated. Ordinary families were stepping forward to provide the kind of caring, stable environments that Harry and other abused children had been denied by the systematic corruption of official child protection services. As evening approached, Harry found himself reflecting on the extraordinary changes that had occurred in just a few months since his discovery of the contract in Vernon's study. The terrified child who had fled into the darkness, clutching evidence of betrayal, had become the catalyst for comprehensive reform that was protecting children throughout the magical world. The Henderson family had included him in their evening routine with the same natural acceptance they showed their own children, treating his presence not as a temporary inconvenience, but as a permanent addition to their family structure. The experience of being wanted and valued for himself rather than tolerated for financial compensation was still overwhelming in its novelty. Thomas Henderson worked for the new Department of Child Protection and Advocacy, where his expertise in trauma counseling was being used to develop training programs for the professionals who would staff the reformed child welfare system. His first-hand experience of Harry's healing process was providing valuable insights into the kind of support that abused children needed to recover from their experiences. Margaret Henderson had taken leave from her position as a primary school head teacher to focus on supporting Harry and the other children who had been placed in their care. Her background in education was proving invaluable in helping traumatized children reconnect with learning and development that had been disrupted by years of systematic abuse. The evening meal was a revelation for Harry, not because the food was particularly elaborate, but because it represented the kind of ordinary family ritual that had been absent from his life for so long. Conversation flowed naturally around topics of mutual interest, with everyone's opinions treated as worthy of consideration, regardless of their age or status within the family hierarchy. James had joined them for dinner, bringing news of the final legal developments that would close the chapter on the conspiracy that had shaped Harry's childhood, while opening new possibilities for his future. The criminal trials were proceeding rapidly, with plea bargains being negotiated for most of the lower-level officials who had participated in the systematic abuse. But the principals in the conspiracy would face full trials under international jurisdiction, with proceedings that would be broadcast throughout the magical world to ensure complete transparency about what had been done and why such failures must never be repeated. The goal was not just individual accountability, but institutional learning that would prevent similar abuses in the future. Perhaps most importantly for Harry's immediate future, James had received approval for his permanent placement with the Henderson family, who had expressed their desire to adopt him if he wished to become a permanent member of their household. The decision would ultimately be Harry's to make, but for the first time in his life, he was being offered a genuine choice about his own future. The adoption proceedings would be conducted under the new legal frameworks that prioritized children's voices in determining their own welfare. Harry would have independent legal representation, access to counseling support, and the right to change his mind at any point if the placement proved unsuitable for his needs. As Harry prepared for sleep in his own room, surrounded by books and possessions that belonged to him rather than being grudgingly shared by reluctant relatives, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him from systematic abuse to genuine family life. The contract that had shattered his world with its revelations had become the foundation for protections that would benefit countless children throughout the magical world. But perhaps most importantly, he had learned that individual courage, properly supported and strategically applied, could indeed change systems that seemed impossibly large and entrenched. His decision to speak out about his experiences had not only secured his own freedom and safety, but had created lasting protections for children he would never meet, in circumstances he could only imagine. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities as he continued to heal from his traumatic experiences while adapting to the reality of being genuinely wanted and valued by adults who cared about his welfare. The battle for systematic reform had been won, but the work of building a better future was just beginning. Justice had finally been served, but more importantly, the foundations for preventing future injustices had been laid with the bedrock of individual courage and sustained by the commitment of people who believed that protecting children was the most important responsibility any society could undertake.